252 million years ago, the Earth held its breath. The morning light falls differently here, in this place where time seems to pool like water in cupped hands, where the wind carries whispers of stories that began long before our first memories took shape. The air moves slowly through ancient valleys, carrying with it the soft scent of possibility and the gentle weight of mystery. If you are finding comfort in these quiet moments together, perhaps you might like to subscribe to join us on more journeys like this one. And if you feel moved to share in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world, it would bring such warmth to know you are there. For those who wish to support these gentle films with a paid membership, your kindness helps create more spaces like this one, more moments where we can rest together and wonder. The silence here feels different from the silence we know today, deeper somehow, as if the very stones remember what it means to wait. This is the story of the Great Dying, though perhaps that name carries too much weight for what we are exploring together tonight. Margaret walks these hills now, her footsteps soft on the limestone paths that wind through the Peak District, but in her mind she moves through deeper time, following the traces of creatures whose names she has learned to speak like prayers. The rocks beneath her feet hold secrets written in languages older than words, stories pressed between layers of stone like flowers in the pages of an ancient book. She has spent 30 years learning to read these stories, and still they surprise her with their gentleness, their quiet insistence that life finds a way even when the world seems to forget how to breathe. The evening light catches the edges of the fossils embedded in the cliff face, each one a small miracle of preservation, a moment when time stopped long enough for stone to remember flesh. What Margaret has found here, in these quiet Yorkshire valleys, might change the way we understand the greatest challenge life has ever faced, though she speaks of her discoveries with the soft hesitation of someone who knows that the earth keeps its deepest secrets close. The Great Dying began not with fire or ice, but with a kind of forgetting. The oceans, which had been the cradle of life for so long, began to forget how to hold oxygen. The forests, which had stretched their green fingers toward the sun for millions of years, began to forget how to sing with the wind. Perhaps 96% of all life in the sea vanished during this time, and 7 out of every 10 species on land simply stopped their ancient dance with the seasons. The numbers feel too large to hold, like trying to cup the ocean in our palms, so we let them flow through our understanding and focus instead on the smaller stories, the ones that fit in the spaces between our heartbeats. Thomas, working in his laboratory in Edinburgh, holds a fragment of rock that once lay at the bottom of an ancient sea, and in its dark surface he can see the moment when the world changed. The fossil record shows us a line drawn across time, a boundary between the world that was and the world that would become, and this line whispers of transformations so complete that even the stones bear witness to their magnitude. The cause may have been fire from deep within the earth itself, a volcanic eruption so vast that it lasted for thousands of years, painting the sky with ash and filling the air with gases that changed the very chemistry of breathing. The Siberian traps, as we call them now, covered an area larger than Europe with molten rock that flowed like slow rivers of destruction, though even destruction might be too harsh a word for this ancient reshaping of the world. The lava flows continued for perhaps 1 million years, which seems like forever to us but was merely a moment in the Earth's long dreaming. The gases released during this time may have warmed the planet by as much as 6 degrees, turning the familiar rhythms of weather into something unrecognizable, something that made the old ways of living impossible for most of the creatures who called this world home. Yet even as the familiar world dissolved around them, some forms of life discovered new ways to persist, new ways to write their stories across the changing landscape of possibility. What strikes Margaret most deeply about this time is not the dying, but the surviving. In the rocks she studies, she finds traces of creatures who learned to live with less oxygen, who found ways to shelter in the deep places where the old rules still applied, at least for a while. These survivors were not necessarily the strongest or the largest, but perhaps the most adaptable, the ones who could let go of old habits and embrace new ways of being in a world that had forgotten its former shape. The recovery took millions of years, which feels like an impossibly long time until we remember that the Earth counts time differently than we do, measuring moments in the slow accumulation of sediment and the patient work of erosion. During this long recovery, life experimented with forms that had never existed before, as if the great forgetting had also been a kind of remembering of possibilities that had been waiting in the wings for their moment to dance across the stage of evolution. The survivors tell us something important about resilience, about the ways that life finds paths forward even when all the familiar routes have been washed away by change. In the shallow seas that remained, small creatures with shells learned to build their homes from different materials, adapting to water that had become more acidic, more hostile to the old ways of growing protective armor. On land, some plants discovered how to live in soils that had been poisoned by volcanic ash, their roots reaching deeper, their leaves growing smaller, their whole approach to gathering sunlight transformed by necessity into something gentler, more efficient. The mammals that would eventually give rise to us were tiny then, no larger than mice, hiding in burrows during the day and venturing out only when the sun had set and the world felt safer for small, warm-blooded creatures trying to make their way in a landscape that belonged to others. Yet even these small survivors carried within them the seeds of futures they could not imagine, possibilities that would unfold over the next 250 million years into forms as unlikely and beautiful as the human capacity to wonder about their own origins. What questions arise when we consider this ancient resilience? How did life discover new ways to extract energy from a world that had been stripped of so many familiar resources? Perhaps the answers lie not in the grand gestures of survival, but in the small adjustments, the tiny innovations that accumulated over generations until they became new ways of being alive. Margaret has found evidence of creatures who learned to cooperate in ways their ancestors never had, sharing resources and creating communities that could weather storms no single individual could have survived alone. The fossil record shows us partnerships between species that seem to have emerged during this time of greatest challenge, as if crisis had taught life new forms of mutual care. Some plants began to form closer relationships with fungi, their roots intertwining with fungal networks that could help them find nutrients in soil that had been depleted by ash and acid rain. Some animals learned to migrate in ways their ancestors never had, following seasonal patterns that had shifted with the changing climate, their journeys becoming longer and more complex as they searched for places where the old abundance still lingered. Thomas spends his evenings walking through the Scottish hills near his laboratory, looking up at stars that have been shining since long before the Great Dying, trying to imagine what the night sky might have looked like to the survivors of that ancient catastrophe. The constellations would have been different then. The Earth's position in space shifted by millions of years of orbital drift, but perhaps the fundamental experience of wonder, of looking up into darkness and seeing light, remained constant across that vast span of time. He thinks often about the lessons these ancient survivors might offer to those of us living through our own time of rapid change, our own moment when familiar patterns seem to be dissolving into uncertainty. The parallels are not exact, of course, and we must be careful not to read our own concerns too directly into the stories written in stone. But there may be wisdom in the way life learned to persist through conditions that seemed impossible, hope in the evidence that communities can form even in the aftermath of great loss. The recovery from the Great Dying was not a return to what had been before, but rather a journey into entirely new forms of flourishing. The forests that grew back were different forests, populated by trees that had learned new relationships with light and soil and rain. The oceans that refilled with life were different oceans, home to creatures whose bodies reflected innovations born from necessity, whose ways of swimming and feeding and reproducing had been shaped by the memory of scarcity and the patient work of adaptation. The very chemistry of the atmosphere changed during this recovery, as new forms of life began to alter the balance of gases in ways that would eventually make possible the explosion of diversity we associate with the age of dinosaurs. Yet this transformation happened slowly, quietly, generation by generation, with no single moment when anyone could have said that the old world had ended and the new world had begun. What moves us most deeply about this ancient story may be its reminder that endings and beginnings are often the same event, seen from different angles of understanding. The Great Dying was also the Great Beginning, the moment when life discovered possibilities it had never explored before, pathways to forms of beauty and complexity that could only emerge from the soil of profound change. The survivors of that distant catastrophe live on in us, their innovations encoded in our cells, their hard-won wisdom flowing through our blood. We are the children of creatures who learned to persist through the impossible, who found ways to create communities of care in landscapes that seemed hostile to life itself. Perhaps this knowledge can comfort us as we face our own moment of uncertainty, our own questions about how to live wisely in a world that seems to be forgetting some of its familiar rhythms. The Earth has practiced recovery before, has learned the art of letting go and beginning again, and in that ancient practice we might find guidance for our own journey into whatever forms of flourishing await us on the far side of change. Margaret returns home each evening to a cottage that overlooks the valley where she does her research, and as she prepares for sleep, she often thinks about the deep time that surrounds us always, the vast patience of stone and sky, and the slow river that flows past her window. The creatures whose stories she studies lived their brief lives embedded in this same deep time, their moments of joy and struggle and discovery nested within rhythms so large that they could barely be perceived, much less understood. Yet somehow they found ways to thrive, to create beauty, to pass along to their descendants the gift of existence itself, wrapped in the hard-won knowledge of how to persist through change. Their legacy lives on in every breath we take, every heartbeat that connects us to the ancient chain of survival and adaptation that links us back to those first survivors of the Great Dying. As sleep approaches, carrying with it dreams we cannot predict or control, we might rest in the knowledge that we too are part of this great experiment in persistence, this ongoing exploration of what it means to be alive in a world that is always, in its own way, being reborn. As sleep approaches, carrying with it dreams we cannot predict or control, we might rest in the knowledge that we too are part of this great experiment in persistence, this ongoing exploration of what it means to be alive in a world that is always, in its own way, being reborn. The autumn air moves through Margaret's cottage with the particular weight that comes just before the first frost, when the year begins to gather itself inward, preparing for the long rest that winter brings to these northern valleys. She sits at her desk by the window, her notebook open to pages covered with careful sketches of trilobite fragments, each drawing a meditation on forms that once moved through ancient seas with purpose we can only imagine. The lamplight catches the edges of her pencil marks, casting tiny shadows that remind her of the way fossil impressions appear in rock when the sun strikes them at just the right angle. Outside, the River Wye moves past her garden with the steady patience of water that has been flowing through this landscape since long before the Great Dying, its voice a constant whisper about the persistence of familiar things even as the world transforms around them. The quality of light at this hour holds something of both ending and beginning, the day releasing its grip on brightness while the night gathers strength for its own quiet work of restoration and dream. Margaret's research has led her to understand that the Great Dying was not a single event but rather a cascade of changes that unfolded over perhaps 60,000 years, which sounds like a long time until we remember that this represents barely a moment in the Earth's vast calendar of transformation. Her notebooks contain observations gathered over decades of patient fieldwork, measurements of carbon isotopes that speak of ancient atmospheric changes, photographs of rock formations that preserve the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods like a line drawn across the face of deep time itself. The specimens arranged on her shelves tell stories of creatures who lived through the early stages of this transformation, their shells and bones carrying chemical signatures that reveal how the oceans became more acidic, how temperatures rose and fell in patterns that challenged every living system to find new ways of maintaining balance. She has spent years learning to read these chemical messages, understanding them as letters written in a language older than words, testimonies from beings who witnessed firsthand the reshaping of their world. The work requires a kind of listening that goes deeper than hearing, an attention that can perceive patterns across millions of years, connections that reveal themselves only to those willing to sit quietly with fragments of the past until their stories begin to emerge. Thomas has been collaborating with Margaret for nearly 15 years now, their correspondence filling boxes with letters that trace the slow development of ideas about survival and adaptation in deep time. His laboratory in Edinburgh occupies the third floor of a Victorian building that overlooks the castle, and on clear evenings he can see the ancient volcanic rock that forms the foundation of that fortress, a reminder that the Earth's creative fire has been shaping this landscape for hundreds of millions of years. His work focuses on the microscopic organisms that somehow persisted through the Great Dying, the bacteria and archaea whose simple forms may have been key to maintaining the basic chemistry necessary for more complex life to eventually recover. Under his microscope, he examines samples of rock that contain fossilized microbial mats, communities of tiny organisms that learned to cooperate in ways that allowed them to survive conditions that would have been fatal to most other forms of life. These ancient partnerships fascinate him because they suggest that cooperation, rather than competition, may have been one of the most important innovations that carried life through its greatest crisis. His notebooks contain detailed observations about the ways these microscopic communities shared resources, created protective environments for each other, and maintained the delicate chemical balances that more complex organisms would later depend upon for their own recovery. The season deepens around both researchers as they continue their quiet work, the shortening days creating longer periods of lamplight and reflection, time that seems particularly suited to contemplating events that unfolded across geological ages. Margaret has noticed that her most important insights often come during these darker months, when the rhythm of her days slows to match the patient pace required for understanding deep time. She has been studying a particular layer of rock that formed during the height of the Great Dying, a stratum that contains evidence of the last communities to flourish before the Great Silence descended upon the fossil record. The creatures preserved in this layer seem to have been living in shallow lagoons that may have provided some protection from the changing chemistry of the open ocean, small refuges where older ways of life could persist for a while longer. Her drawings capture the delicate spiral patterns of ammonite shells, the branching structures of bryozoans, the simple beauty of brachiopods that filtered nutrients from water that was slowly becoming hostile to their ancient methods of survival. Each fossil represents not just an individual organism, but an entire way of being in the world, a particular solution to the challenges of growth and reproduction and community that had been refined over millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. Thomas spends his winter evenings walking through the old sections of Edinburgh, past buildings constructed from sandstone that contains its own fossil treasures, reminders that this city rests upon layers of ancient life transformed into the foundation for human civilization. He often stops at the small park near his flat, where a stone bench provides a place to sit quietly and watch the stars emerge as the sky darkens. The constellations visible from this northern latitude include stars that were shining during the Great Dying, their light a bridge across the vast gulf of time that separates us from those ancient survivors. He has calculated that some of the photons reaching his eyes began their journey through space when the first communities were struggling to adapt to the changing conditions of the late Permian world, a connection that fills him with wonder at the ways that light carries messages across both space and time. His research has revealed that the microbial communities he studies may have been the hidden engineers of recovery, their invisible work gradually restoring the chemical conditions that would eventually allow more complex ecosystems to flourish once again. These tiny organisms possess an ancient wisdom about adaptation, an ability to alter their own metabolism in response to changing conditions, to form new partnerships when old ones become impossible, to persist in environments that seem utterly hostile to life. The deeper Margaret delves into the fossil record of this period, the more she appreciates the complexity of what recovery meant for the survivors of the Great Dying. The world that emerged from this crisis was not simply a restoration of what had been lost, but rather an exploration of entirely new possibilities for living systems. The forests that grew back were dominated by different groups of plants, conifers and cycads that had learned new relationships with light and soil, and the insects that helped them reproduce. The oceans filled with new forms of life that reflected innovations born from the necessity of surviving in water that had become more acidic and less oxygenated than their ancestors had ever known. Perhaps most remarkably, the survivors developed new forms of cooperation that crossed the boundaries between different kingdoms of life, partnerships between plants and fungi, between different species of animals, between visible organisms and the microscopic communities that maintained the basic chemistry of their shared environments. These innovations suggest that one of the most important lessons from the Great Dying may be about the power of collaboration in the face of overwhelming challenge, the ways that individual survival often depends upon the health and resilience of larger communities. The winter light in the Peak District carries a particular quality during the months when Margaret does her most intensive fieldwork, a clarity that seems to reveal details invisible during other seasons. The limestone cliffs where she searches for fossils stand out against the sky like pages from an ancient book, their layers telling stories of seas that rose and fell across this landscape over hundreds of millions of years. She has learned to read these stone stories with the patience of someone who understands that the most important revelations often come slowly, emerging from accumulated observations rather than dramatic discoveries. Her field notes from this season record the subtle ways that fossil communities change as she moves through the rock layers that span the Great Dying, documenting the gradual disappearance of familiar forms and the equally gradual appearance of new experiments in living. The work requires a kind of attention that modern life rarely demands, a willingness to spend hours examining small fragments of stone for the traces of ancient life they might contain, to sit quietly with questions that may not have clear answers, to remain open to possibilities that challenge familiar assumptions about how life responds to crisis. Thomas has been corresponding with researchers around the world who are studying similar questions about survival and recovery in deep time, their letters forming a quiet network of inquiry that spans continents and disciplines. A colleague in Australia has been examining rocks that formed in the southern hemisphere during the Great Dying, finding evidence that the crisis affected different regions in different ways, that some places may have served as refuges where older forms of life could persist longer than they did elsewhere. A researcher in China has discovered fossil communities that seem to represent entirely new experiments in living, creatures that combined features from different evolutionary lineages in ways that suggest the boundaries between familiar categories of life became more fluid during times of great change. These collaborations remind Thomas that understanding deep time requires perspectives from many different places and ways of knowing, that the story of ancient survival can only be told through patient accumulation of observations from researchers willing to spend their lives in conversation with stone and fossil and the subtle chemical signatures preserved in very old rocks. The darkness comes earlier now, and with it a quality of silence that seems particularly suited to contemplating events that unfolded across geological ages. Margaret often finds herself working by lamplight well into the evening, her desk covered with photographs and drawings and notes that represent years of careful observation. She has been tracing the recovery of life through rock layers that formed in the millions of years following the Great Dying, documenting the slow return of diversity and complexity to ecosystems that had been stripped down to their most essential elements. The process was not steady or predictable, but rather proceeded in fits and starts, with periods of rapid experimentation followed by longer intervals of gradual refinement and consolidation. Some of the innovations that emerged during this recovery would prove to be evolutionary dead ends, interesting experiments that flourished for a while before disappearing from the fossil record. Others would become the foundation for entirely new ways of organizing living systems, partnerships, and strategies that continue to shape life on Earth to this day. The pattern suggests something important about the nature of recovery itself, the ways that healing from great trauma often involves not just returning to familiar patterns, but discovering entirely new possibilities for flourishing. As the year continues its slow turn toward winter, both researchers find themselves drawn to questions that seem to hover at the edges of their scientific work, questions about resilience and meaning that connect their studies of ancient life to their own experience of living through times of rapid change. The Great Dying may have been the most severe crisis that life on Earth has ever faced, but it was not the last, and the strategies that carried life through that ancient catastrophe may offer guidance for understanding how communities persist through other forms of overwhelming challenge. The fossil record suggests that the most successful survivors were not necessarily the strongest or largest or most numerous, but rather those who could adapt their ways of living when familiar patterns became impossible, who could form new partnerships when old ones broke down, who could find ways to cooperate across traditional boundaries when cooperation became essential for survival. These lessons feel particularly relevant during moments when the familiar rhythms of human civilization seem to be shifting in ways that demand new forms of wisdom, new approaches to the challenges of living together on a planet that is always, in its own way, in the process of transformation. Perhaps the ancient survivors of the Great Dying have something to teach us about the patient work of recovery, the quiet persistence required to carry life forward through periods when the future seems uncertain and the past provides no clear map for the journey ahead. Perhaps the ancient survivors of the Great Dying have something to teach us about the patient work of recovery, the quiet persistence required to carry life forward through periods when the future seems uncertain and the past provides no clear map for the journey ahead. Margaret pulls out a field notebook from 1997, its leather cover worn soft from years of being carried in her rucksack through the limestone country of the Peak District, the pages yellowed at the edges and filled with her careful handwriting documenting fossil finds from a summer when the weather was unusually dry and the rock faces revealed details that rain normally kept hidden. The ink has faded slightly, but the sketches remain clear, small drawings of brachiopod shells and bryozoan colonies arranged like pressed flowers between paragraphs that describe the quality of light on particular mornings, the way shadows fell across the cliff faces where ancient seafloors lay exposed to the modern sky. She remembers that summer as a time of quiet revelations, moments when patterns began to emerge from what had seemed like random distributions of fossil fragments, connections that suggested the communities preserved in these rocks had been more organized, more cooperative than anyone had previously imagined. The notebook falls open to a page where she drew the outline of a particularly well-preserved trilobite, its segmented body curled as if it had been sleeping when the sediments covered it 250 million years ago. And beside the drawing, she wrote a question that still intrigues her today about whether some creatures might have found ways to slow their metabolism during the worst periods of environmental stress, entering states of dormancy that allowed them to wait for better conditions rather than trying to actively adapt to the changing world around them. Thomas spreads several topographic maps across his desk, each one marked with small symbols indicating sites where he has collected samples over the past 2 decades. The accumulation of careful fieldwork that has taken him from the windswept shores of Scotland to the quiet valleys of Wales where ancient river systems left their signatures in stone. The maps show elevations and contours, but they also reveal something else, a pattern in the distribution of his sampling sites that follows the outlines of landscapes that existed during the late Permian period, when what is now Britain lay much closer to the equator and was covered by shallow seas that supported communities of life unlike anything that exists today. He traces these ancient shorelines with his finger, following routes that water took millions of years ago, pathways that might have served as corridors for migration when the familiar habitats began to disappear and survival required movement toward refuges that could provide temporary shelter from the transforming world. The samples from these sites contain traces of microbial communities that seem to bridge the gap between the old world and the new, organisms that maintained the basic chemistry necessary for life while more visible species disappeared from the fossil record, their invisible work creating the foundation upon which recovery would eventually build. Each collection site tells part of a larger story about persistence and adaptation, about the ways that life found pathways through crisis by following the subtle geographies of possibility that existed even during the most difficult periods of transformation. The late afternoon light moves slowly across Margaret's study, casting long shadows that shift and change as the sun settles toward the horizon. The quality of illumination at this hour, particularly suited to examining the fine details preserved in fossil specimens that might be missed under harsher lighting conditions. She has arranged several samples on her desk according to their age, creating a timeline that spans the critical period when the Great Dying transformed the conditions for existence on Earth. Each piece of stone a chapter in the story of how communities responded to changes that challenged every familiar strategy for survival. The oldest samples contain evidence of ecosystems that had been stable for millions of years, their fossil assemblages dominated by creatures that had perfected particular approaches to filtering food from seawater, building protective shells, and creating the complex networks of relationship that allowed diverse communities to flourish in the oxygen-rich seas of the late Permian world. The youngest samples tell very different stories, preserving evidence of experiments in living that emerged from the simplified ecosystems that remained after the Great Reduction, innovations that might never have developed under more crowded conditions but that proved crucial for rebuilding the complexity that had been lost. Between these endpoints lies a sequence of intermediate stages that document the gradual transformation, periods when old and new approaches to survival existed side by side, when the outcome of the crisis was still uncertain and multiple pathways toward recovery remained possible. Thomas opens a letter from a colleague in Australia who has been studying the Permian-Triassic boundary in rocks that formed in the southern hemisphere, finding evidence that the Great Dying affected different parts of the world at different times and in different ways, suggesting that recovery may have begun in some regions while crisis was still deepening in others. The letter includes photographs of fossil assemblages that preserve communities which seem to have maintained some of the complexity that was lost elsewhere, islands of older patterns of life that persisted in places where local conditions provided temporary refuge from the global changes that were reshaping the planet. These observations raise questions about what might have been possible if more such refuges had existed, whether the severity of the Great Dying reflected not just the magnitude of environmental change but also the particular vulnerability of ecosystems that had become too specialized, too dependent upon stable conditions to adapt quickly when the rules began to change. The existence of these refuges suggests that recovery was not simply a matter of invention from scratch, but also involved the preservation and gradual expansion of approaches to living that had been tested by millions of years of previous evolution, strategies that could serve as seeds for rebuilding when conditions became more favorable for complex communities to flourish once again. Margaret has been comparing her British specimens with fossil collections from sites around the world, looking for patterns that might reveal whether the innovations that emerged during recovery were truly new inventions or modifications of approaches that had existed before the crisis but had been rare or restricted to particular environments. The comparisons suggest something intriguing about the relationship between crisis and creativity, the ways that periods of great simplification can reveal possibilities that were always present but had been hidden by the dominance of more successful strategies during stable periods. Some of the forms that appear in the early Triassic rocks seem to combine features from very different lineages, as if the breakdown of established communities had created opportunities for partnerships that would never have been possible under normal conditions, alliances between organisms that had previously competed for the same resources or occupied completely separate ecological niches. These hybrid communities fascinate her because they suggest that one of the most important innovations of the recovery period may have been the discovery of new forms of cooperation, ways of sharing resources and information that allowed very different types of organisms to support each other through the long process of rebuilding stable ecosystems from the fragments that had survived the Great Dissolution. Thomas has noticed that many of his most significant discoveries have come from rock layers that formed in environments that were marginal during the Permian period, places like estuaries and coastal lagoons where fresh water mixed with salt water and created conditions that were already challenging for most marine organisms even before the global crisis began. These marginal environments may have served as training grounds for the innovations that would prove crucial during the Great Dying, places where organisms had already learned to cope with variable conditions, fluctuating chemistry, and the kinds of stress that would become widespread as the crisis deepened. The microbial communities preserved in samples from these transitional zones show evidence of metabolic flexibility that seems to have been rare in more stable marine environments, abilities to switch between different sources of energy and different strategies for processing nutrients that allowed them to persist when more specialized organisms could no longer maintain their particular approaches to survival. The possibility that marginal environments served as sources of innovation during the recovery raises questions about the role of stress in driving evolutionary creativity, whether the adaptations that prove most valuable during times of crisis are those that develop in places where life is already difficult rather than those that emerge from the comfortable abundance of stable ecosystems. The winter sky darkens earlier each day, and Margaret finds herself working more often by lamplight, the warm circle of illumination on her desk creating an intimate space for contemplating specimens that carry evidence of transformations that unfolded across millions of years of deep time. She has been studying a sequence of rock layers that document the gradual recovery of reef ecosystems after the Great Dying, communities that took nearly 10 million years to regain the complexity and diversity that had characterized the great reefs of the Permian world. Yet the reefs that eventually emerged were built by very different organisms using very different strategies for creating the large-scale structures that provide habitat for countless other species. The early stages of reef recovery seem to have been dominated by simple organisms that could grow quickly in the harsh conditions that persisted after the crisis, opportunistic species that could colonize disturbed environments and begin the slow work of creating more favorable conditions for other organisms to establish themselves. These pioneer communities gradually modified their environments in ways that made more complex partnerships possible, changing water chemistry, creating shelter, and establishing the nutrient cycles that would support the diverse ecosystems that eventually flourished in the Middle and Late Triassic periods. Thomas spends his evenings reading papers about modern ecosystems that are undergoing rapid environmental change, looking for patterns that might illuminate the strategies that allowed ancient communities to persist through the transformations of the Great Dying, though he remains careful not to assume that contemporary changes operate according to the same rules that governed ancient transitions. The parallels that do emerge suggest something important about the relationship between diversity and resilience, the ways that communities with many different approaches to survival seem better able to maintain essential functions when familiar patterns break down and new strategies must be discovered through trial and error. The modern research points to the crucial role of what ecologists call functional diversity, the presence of organisms that perform similar roles in different ways, creating redundancy that allows ecosystems to continue operating even when particular species are lost or when environmental conditions change in ways that favor some approaches over others. This concept helps explain why the communities that recovered most successfully from the Great Dying seem to have been those that maintained or quickly rebuilt this kind of functional diversity, ensuring that essential processes like nutrient cycling and energy transfer could continue even as the specific organisms performing these functions changed in response to the new conditions. Margaret often returns to a particular section of cliff face in the Peak District where the rock layers that span the Great Dying are particularly well exposed, each band of limestone and shale representing thousands of years of sedimentation that preserved snapshots of communities as they responded to the changing world around them. The boundary layer itself is marked by a distinctive change in the color and texture of the rock, a shift from the light-colored limestone that characterizes the late Permian to the darker, more clay-rich sediments that mark the beginning of the Triassic period, visual evidence of changes in ocean chemistry and sedimentation patterns that accompanied the Great Transformation. Above this boundary, the rock layers tell a story of gradual recovery that proceeded in stages, each marked by the appearance of new types of fossils that document experiments in living that were tested and either abandoned or refined based on their success in the changing environment. The sequence reveals something important about the pace of recovery, the ways that rebuilding complex ecosystems required not just the invention of new strategies, but also the time necessary for these innovations to be tested and modified through countless generations of organisms learning to live in a world that was still discovering its new rules. Thomas has been collaborating with researchers who study the genetic signatures of ancient organisms, looking for evidence of the evolutionary innovations that emerged during the recovery from the Great Dying and that continue to influence the strategies used by modern life to cope with environmental change. The molecular evidence suggests that many of the partnerships between different types of organisms that characterize modern ecosystems may have originated during this period of crisis and recovery, alliances that were initially forged as survival strategies but that proved so successful that they became permanent features of the way life organizes itself on Earth. These ancient partnerships include the relationships between plants and the fungi that help them extract nutrients from soil, the collaborations between animals and the microorganisms that help them digest food, and the complex networks of cooperation that allow different species to share information about resources and threats in ways that benefit entire communities. The possibility that some of the most fundamental aspects of modern ecosystems can trace their origins to innovations that emerged during the Great Dying suggests something profound about the relationship between crisis and creativity, the ways that periods of great challenge can become sources of transformation that reshape the possibilities for life in ways that persist across hundreds of millions of years. The samples arranged on Thomas's laboratory shelves represent fragments of evidence about forms of resilience that operated on scales too small to be easily visible, strategies for survival that depended upon the ability of microscopic organisms to modify their environments in subtle but crucial ways that created opportunities for other forms of life to establish themselves and gradually rebuild the complexity that had been lost. Under his microscope, thin sections of rock from the early Triassic period reveal networks of filaments and sheets that may represent the preserved remains of microbial mats, communities of bacteria and archaea that learned to cooperate in ways that allowed them to create their own favorable conditions even in environments that had become hostile to most other forms of life. These microbial communities seem to have served as foundation stones for recovery, their patient work gradually restoring the chemical balances and nutrient cycles that more complex organisms would eventually depend upon for their own survival and reproduction. The preservation of these microscopic communities in the fossil record is itself a kind of miracle, requiring conditions that were rare and processes that operated on timescales that dwarf human experience. Yet their survival in stone allows us to glimpse strategies for persistence that might otherwise have been lost to the deep past. Approaches to cooperation and adaptation that continue to operate in modern ecosystems but that had their origins in the most challenging period that life on Earth has ever faced. The preservation of these microscopic communities in the fossil record is itself a kind of miracle, requiring conditions that were rare and processes that operated on timescales that dwarf human experience. Yet their survival in stone allows us to glimpse strategies for persistence that might otherwise have been lost to the deep past. Approaches to cooperation and adaptation that continue to operate in modern ecosystems but that had their origins in the most challenging period that life on Earth has ever faced. Margaret stands at the edge of the limestone cliff where she has been working for 23 years. The morning mist rising from the valley below carrying with it the scent of wet grass and the distant sound of sheep calling to each other across fields that were once the floor of an ancient sea. The light at this hour moves differently than it does later in the day, softer and more forgiving, revealing details in the rock face that harsh sunlight would wash away or cast into shadows too deep to penetrate with careful observation. She has come here early because yesterday evening, while examining photographs of a fossil assemblage under her desk lamp, she noticed something that made her set down her magnifying glass and sit quietly for several minutes, trying to understand what her eyes had been telling her. The pattern she thought she saw seemed impossible at first, an arrangement of shells and fragments that suggested not random burial but something more deliberate, more organized, as if the creatures preserved in this particular layer of stone had been engaged in some form of collective behavior when the sediments covered them 251 million years ago. The rock face rises perhaps 15 meters above the narrow ledge where Margaret stands, each band of limestone representing thousands of years of slow accumulation on the floor of a sea that stretched across what would eventually become northern England. And this morning the stone seems to hold light in a way that makes the fossil impressions appear almost three-dimensional, as if the ancient creatures were pressing themselves up through the surface toward the modern air. She runs her fingers along a section where several brachiopod shells cluster together in a pattern that might be coincidental but that feels somehow intentional, their arrangement forming what could be described as a rough circle with smaller shells nested inside larger ones in a way that suggests they may have been filtering nutrients more efficiently by working together than they could have managed as isolated individuals. The limestone feels cool under her touch despite the warming sun, its surface worn smooth by countless seasons of rain and frost, but still preserving the delicate ridges and curves that marked these shells when they were homes for living creatures rather than impressions in stone. Thomas joins her on the ledge just as the mist begins to clear from the valley, his boots scuffing softly against the rocky surface as he carries the portable microscope they have been using to examine specimens in the field, its metal case catching glints of sunlight that reflect back toward the cliff face like signals exchanged between past and present. The discovery that has drawn them here so early began 3 days ago when Margaret was examining a thin section of rock under high magnification, looking for traces of the microbial communities that Thomas studies, when she noticed something unexpected in the spaces between the larger fossils, fine structures that seemed too organized to be random but too small to be easily visible without careful preparation and powerful lenses. The structures appeared to be networks of some kind, delicate filaments that connected different shells and fragments in ways that suggested they had been living parts of a larger system rather than simply individual organisms that happened to die in the same place at the same time. Thomas had spent hours confirming what Margaret thought she was seeing, using chemical stains and different lighting techniques to reveal details that had been preserved in the rock for hundreds of millions of years, but had never been noticed because no one had thought to look for evidence of cooperation at this particular scale and in this particular way. The network seemed to extend through several layers of sediment, suggesting that whatever process had created them had persisted for thousands of years, long enough to be preserved as a recurring pattern rather than a single unusual event that might have been dismissed as coincidental. Margaret sets up the portable microscope on a flat section of the ledge, adjusting its position to catch the morning light at the angle that will best illuminate the surface of the rock she wants to examine. Her movements careful and deliberate as she handles equipment that must reveal details measured in fractions of millimeters preserved in stone that has been weathering on this cliff face for millions of years. The eyepiece is cold against her cheek as she peers through the lenses, rotating the focus knob with tiny adjustments until the surface of the limestone resolves into sharp detail, revealing a landscape of preserved shells and fragments that tells stories about communities that lived and died before the first vertebrates had learned to walk on land. What she sees through the microscope confirms what the photographs had suggested, patterns that seem too regular to be explained by the random processes of burial and fossilization, arrangements of shells that suggest these ancient creatures had found ways to organize themselves in response to the changing conditions that preceded the Great Dying. The shells appear to be connected by faint traces that might represent the preserved remains of organic material, threads or films that could have carried nutrients or information between individuals in ways that allowed them to function as components of larger systems rather than simply as isolated organisms competing for limited resources. Thomas leans over Margaret's shoulder to look through the microscope, his breathing steady and quiet as he studies the patterns she has been documenting, occasionally making soft sounds of surprise or recognition when details become clear that had been hidden in the photographs they examined back at the cottage. The structures they are seeing may represent one of the earliest examples of the kind of cooperation that would prove crucial for survival during the Great Dying, partnerships that allowed individual organisms to share the work of extracting nutrients from water that was becoming more acidic and less oxygen-rich as the global crisis deepened. The preservation of these delicate connections required conditions that were rare in the ancient world, moments when burial was gentle and rapid enough to capture organic material that would normally decay within days or weeks of an organism's death. Yet somehow these particular communities were buried in ways that allowed even their most fragile partnerships to be preserved as impressions in stone. The morning air carries the sound of wind moving through grass and the distant calls of birds that have built their nests in crevices along the cliff face, creating a soundtrack that seems appropriate for this moment of connection with forms of life that solved problems similar to those faced by modern communities, but using strategies that operated on different scales and according to different rules. The pattern that emerges from careful study of the fossil assemblage suggests something remarkable about the final communities that flourished before the Great Dying. Evidence that they may have been experimenting with forms of organization that were more sophisticated than anything that had existed before, partnerships that allowed them to extract maximum benefit from environments that were already becoming challenging even before the global crisis reached its peak. Margaret adjusts the microscope to examine a different section of the rock surface, her movements creating tiny shadows that shift across the limestone as the angle of illumination changes, revealing new details in areas that had appeared blank under different lighting conditions. The shells in this section seem to be arranged in even more complex patterns, with smaller individuals positioned in ways that might have allowed them to benefit from the feeding activities of larger neighbors, creating cascades of resource sharing that could have made entire communities more efficient at surviving in water that was beginning to lose the chemical stability that had supported marine ecosystems for millions of years. The discovery suggests that cooperation may have been not just a response to the crisis of the Great Dying, but also a strategy that was already being explored by the most innovative communities before the crisis began, partnerships that had been tested and refined during the gradual environmental changes that preceded the great acceleration of transformation. Thomas photographs the patterns they are documenting, his camera clicking softly as he captures images that will allow them to study these formations in greater detail back at his laboratory in Edinburgh, though he knows that no photograph can fully convey the three-dimensional relationships that become apparent when examining the actual rock surface under changing conditions of light and magnification. The fossil assemblage seems to tell a story about adaptation that operates on multiple scales simultaneously, individual organisms modifying their behavior in response to local conditions while also participating in larger systems that created emergent properties not possessed by any single participant. The morning sun climbs higher as they work, its angle changing in ways that create new patterns of shadow and illumination across the cliff face, revealing details that were invisible earlier and hiding others that had been clearly visible when the light approached from different directions. The rock surface seems to respond to these changes like a text that can be read differently depending upon the conditions under which it is examined, each shift in lighting revealing new information about the communities preserved within its crystalline structure. Margaret has been wondering whether similar patterns might exist at other sites around the world, whether the cooperation they are documenting here represents a local innovation that developed in this particular ancient sea or a more widespread response to the environmental changes that preceded the Great Dying, a strategy that was being explored by communities across the planet as they faced the challenge of surviving in a world that was slowly forgetting how to support the forms of life that had flourished for millions of years. The question could potentially be answered through careful examination of fossil assemblages from sites in other countries, though such work would require the kind of international collaboration that takes years to organize and decades to complete, patient exchanges of specimens and data that operate according to the same slow rhythms that govern the processes of fossilization and erosion that preserved these ancient communities for modern study. Thomas has already begun reaching out to colleagues who work with similar material from the late Permian period, sharing photographs and preliminary observations in letters that will circulate through the informal networks that connect researchers interested in the deep patterns of cooperation and survival that shaped the history of life on Earth. The wind picks up slightly as the morning progresses, carrying with it the sounds and scents of the modern landscape that surrounds this window into deep time. Reminders that the work of cooperation and adaptation continues in the present just as it did during the ancient crises that tested the resilience of living systems in ways that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. Margaret can hear sheep moving through the fields below the cliff, their bells creating a gentle percussion that mingles with the sound of wind in the grass and the distant rush of water over stones in the stream that follows the valley floor toward the Irish Sea. These contemporary sounds seem somehow connected to the ancient stories preserved in the rock, reminders that the strategies for survival and community building that they are documenting have deep roots in the history of life, approaches to cooperation that have been tested and refined through countless generations of organisms learning to live together in environments that were constantly changing in response to forces operating on scales that dwarf individual experience. Thomas examines a section of the fossil assemblage where the preservation seems particularly detailed, the microscope revealing structures that appear to connect not just shells from the same species but different types of organisms that might have been sharing resources or information in ways that allowed them to function as components of integrated systems rather than simply as neighbors competing for space and nutrients. The possibility that these ancient communities had discovered forms of partnership that crossed the boundaries between different groups of organisms suggests something important about the innovative potential that emerges during periods of environmental stress. times when familiar strategies prove inadequate and survival requires experimentation with approaches that might seem impossible under more stable conditions. The preservation of these partnerships in stone required conditions that were rare and processes that operated with a precision that seems almost miraculous, yet their existence in the fossil record provides evidence that cooperation has ancient roots in the history of life, strategies that were being explored long before the Great Dying created conditions that made such partnerships essential for survival. The limestone beneath their feet represents millions of years of slow accumulation, countless generations of marine organisms living and dying in seas that rose and fell across this landscape according to rhythms controlled by forces operating on geological scales. Climate changes and tectonic movements that created the conditions under which these ancient experiments in cooperation could unfold and eventually be preserved for study by researchers working hundreds of millions of years later. Margaret runs her hand across the surface of the rock, feeling the subtle texture created by the impressions of shells and the mineral crystals that filled the spaces between them during the long process of fossilization. Each tiny irregularity a record of processes that operated with patience that makes human timescales seem like brief moments in a much larger story. The cliff face extends both above and below their current position, layers upon layers of similar limestone that contain other communities from other periods in the deep history of life. Assemblages that might reveal how the strategies they are documenting evolved over time, how cooperation and partnership developed from simple beginnings into the complex networks that would prove crucial for survival during the great crisis that lay ahead. Thomas adjusts the microscope to examine the boundaries between different fossil shells, looking for evidence of the organic connections that seem to link individual organisms into larger functional units, partnerships that might have allowed these ancient communities to share the work of filtering nutrients from seawater and processing the waste products that could become toxic if allowed to accumulate in the spaces between closely packed individuals. The morning light continues to change as the sun climbs higher, creating new patterns of illumination that reveal details that were hidden earlier and casting others into shadow. A reminder that understanding these ancient communities requires patience and the willingness to examine evidence from multiple perspectives before drawing conclusions about processes that operated according to rules that may have been different from those that govern modern ecosystems. The work feels like a conversation with deep time, an exchange that requires careful attention to details that might seem insignificant individually, but that form patterns when considered together, connections that suggest forms of organization that were more sophisticated than anything that had existed before in the history of life on Earth. Margaret steps back from the microscope and looks across the valley toward the hills that rise on the far side. Their slopes covered with the green of modern grass and the stone walls that divide ancient fields into patterns that reflect human strategies for organizing landscape and resources, boundaries that have existed for centuries, but that seem temporary when considered against the background of the geological processes that shaped this terrain over hundreds of millions of years. The fossil communities they are studying operated according to different principles than those that guide human organization, partnerships that emerged from necessity and were refined through countless generations of trial and error, strategies that were tested not in decades or centuries but across millions of years of gradual environmental change. The morning air carries the scent of flowers blooming in the fields below, reminders that the work of cooperation continues in the present, that the partnerships between plants and pollinators, between different species of birds and mammals, between organisms and the microbial communities that help them process nutrients represent continuations of strategies that have ancient roots in the history of life, approaches to survival that were being explored by the communities preserved in this limestone cliff long before the Great Dying created conditions that made such cooperation essential for persistence through the greatest crisis that life on Earth has ever faced. What other forms of partnership might have existed during that ancient time? Connections that were too delicate to be preserved in stone or too subtle to be detected by the methods currently available for studying the fossil record. Strategies for cooperation that operated on scales or through mechanisms that remain hidden in the spaces between what can be observed and what can only be imagined about the deep history of resilience and adaptation that connects all living systems across the vast expanses of time that separate the present from the ancient communities that first discovered the power of working together when the familiar world began to change in ways that demanded new approaches to the challenge of staying alive? What other forms of partnership might have existed during that ancient time? Connections that were too delicate to be preserved in stone or too subtle to be detected by the methods currently available for studying the fossil record, strategies for cooperation that operated on scales or through mechanisms that remain hidden in the spaces between what can be observed and what can only be imagined about the deep history of resilience and adaptation that connects all living systems across the vast expanses of time that separate the present from the ancient communities that first discovered the power of working together when the familiar world began to change in ways that demanded new approaches to the challenge of staying alive. Margaret wraps each fossil specimen carefully in tissue paper before placing it in the wooden collection box her grandfather made for her fieldwork 40 years ago. The lid worn smooth from countless openings and closings during summers spent walking the limestone hills of the Peak District with a magnifying glass and notebook, documenting the arrangements of shells and fragments that seemed to whisper stories about communities that learned to share resources when the familiar abundance began to fade. The afternoon light falls differently now, slanting through clouds that cast moving shadows across the cliff face, revealing patterns in the rock that had been invisible under the morning sun. Subtle alignments of fossils that appear and disappear as the illumination shifts like messages written in a language that can only be read under particular conditions of light and shadow. Thomas photographs each specimen before it is wrapped, his camera clicking softly as he documents the position and orientation of shells that seem to cluster together in ways that might indicate they were connected by organic material during life, partnerships that allowed individual organisms to function as components of larger systems that could extract nutrients more efficiently from water that was slowly becoming more acidic and less hospitable to traditional approaches to survival. The walk back to Margaret's cottage follows paths that wind through fields where sheep graze among limestone outcrops that contain their own fossil treasures, evidence of different periods in the deep history of life when various experiments in cooperation and competition played out across ancient seafloors that are now exposed to modern sky. The wooden gate at the entrance to her garden creaks as they pass through, its hinges worn by decades of use and painted white many times over the years, though patches of older paint show through where the weather has worn the surface thin, creating patterns that remind Margaret of the way geological processes reveal earlier periods in the history of rock formations, older stories becoming visible when newer layers are stripped away by patient erosion. Her study feels particularly warm after the cool morning air, the windows fogged slightly from the temperature difference, creating surfaces that catch and diffuse the afternoon light in ways that make the fossil specimens arranged on her desk appear to glow with their own inner illumination. Thomas sets up his portable microscope near the window where the light is best, adjusting the position carefully to avoid glare while maximizing the clarity of details that measure fractions of millimeters, connections between ancient organisms that might reveal how cooperation emerged as a strategy for survival during the gradual environmental changes that preceded the Great Dying. The first specimen they examine under high magnification shows traces of what appear to be organic films connecting shells from different species, delicate structures that were preserved only because burial was gentle and rapid enough to capture materials that would normally decay within days of an organism's death. Yet these particular communities were covered by sediments in ways that allowed even their most fragile partnerships to survive the long transformation from living tissue to mineral. Impression. Margaret adjusts the focus while Thomas takes notes in his field journal, his handwriting small and precise as he documents observations that might seem insignificant individually, but that could form larger patterns when compared with evidence from other sites and other periods in the fossil record. The organic connections appear to branch and merge in ways that suggest they carried nutrients or information between individuals, creating networks that allowed communities to respond to local changes in water chemistry or food availability more quickly and effectively than isolated organisms could manage on their own. The preservation of such delicate structures seems almost miraculous when considered against the harsh processes of fossilization that destroyed most traces of soft tissue. Yet their existence in these particular specimens provides glimpses of partnerships that might have been widespread during the late Permian period, but that are visible now only in rare locations where conditions were perfect for capturing evidence of cooperation that operated through mechanisms too subtle to leave obvious. Traces in stone. Thomas opens his correspondence file and reads portions of a letter from a colleague in Germany who has been studying similar fossil assemblages from sites near Munich. Formations that preserve communities which seem to show comparable patterns of organization but that lived in different environmental conditions, suggesting that the innovations they are documenting might represent responses to widespread changes rather than local adaptations to particular circumstances. The German specimens contain evidence of partnerships between organisms that had previously been thought to be competitors. Arrangements that allowed different species to share the work of processing nutrients and managing waste products in ways that created more stable local environments, even as larger regional and global systems were beginning to experience the stresses that would eventually culminate in the Great Dying. Margaret prepares thin sections of rock for detailed microscopic examination, a process that requires patience and skill as she grinds samples to precise thicknesses that will allow light to pass through the mineral matrix, while preserving the fine structures that might contain evidence of ancient organic connections, each sample representing hours of careful preparation that could reveal details invisible to surface observation or be destroyed by the slightest error in technique. The late afternoon passes quietly as they work, the cottage filled with the soft sounds of careful scientific observation, the occasional quiet exclamation when a detail becomes clear that had been hidden before, the rustle of pages being turned in field notebooks that contain decades of accumulated observations about the patterns of cooperation and competition that shaped ancient communities during one of the most challenging periods in the history of life on Earth. Margaret has been comparing measurements from different specimens, looking for consistent features that might indicate these partnerships were not random associations but rather structured relationships that developed according to predictable principles, systems that emerged when environmental stress made individual survival strategies inadequate and favored innovations that allowed organisms to share resources and information in ways that benefited entire communities. The data suggests that the most successful partnerships were those that connected organisms with complementary abilities, arrangements that allowed different species to specialize in particular functions while depending upon others for services they could not provide for themselves, creating webs of interdependence that made communities more resilient to environmental changes, but also more vulnerable to disruptions that affected key partners in the network. Thomas has been examining samples under polarized light, a technique that reveals crystal structures and mineral compositions that can provide information about the chemical conditions that existed when these organisms were alive, and when they were buried in sediments that would eventually become limestone, evidence about ocean chemistry and acidity levels that helps explain why some partnerships were preserved while others left no traces in the fossil record. The polarized light creates rainbow patterns in the thin sections of rock, blues and yellows and reds that shift and change as the sample is rotated, beautiful abstractions that represent the molecular architecture of minerals that formed around ancient shells and organic materials during millions of years of slow transformation from seafloor sediment to solid stone. Within these colorful patterns, subtle details become visible that indicate how organic material was distributed between shells, whether connections were temporary associations or more permanent structures that persisted long enough to be buried and preserved as part of the fossil assemblage. The beauty of the polarized light images seems fitting for evidence of partnerships that might have been among the most sophisticated forms of cooperation that had evolved by the late Permian period, innovations that were being tested and refined just as the environmental conditions that made such partnerships necessary were beginning to intensify. Margaret prepares tea as the winter daylight begins to fade, the familiar ritual of heating water and arranging cups providing a quiet transition between the intense focus required for microscopic observation and the broader contemplation that comes when evidence begins to form patterns that suggest larger meanings, connections between individual discoveries, and the deep history of resilience and adaptation that stretches back through hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. The steam from the tea creates temporary patterns in the cool air of the study, ephemeral forms that appear and disappear like the organic connections they have been documenting, structures that existed for millions of years in the ancient world, but that can only be glimpsed now through careful preparation and patient observation under precisely controlled conditions. Thomas accepts his cup with quiet gratitude, the warmth spreading through his hands as he continues to study photographs of fossil assemblages that seem to reveal more detail each time he examines them, patterns that become clearer as his eyes learn to recognize the subtle traces of ancient partnerships that were preserved against all odds in these particular specimens. The evening light entering through the study windows creates conditions that make the fossil specimens appear different than they had under the harsher illumination of midday, shadows falling in ways that emphasize textures and connections that had been less obvious earlier, reminders that understanding ancient communities requires patience and the willingness to examine evidence from multiple perspectives before drawing conclusions about processes that operated according to rules that may have been different from those that govern modern ecosystems. Margaret has been sketching the arrangements of shells in her most promising specimens, her drawings capturing spatial relationships that photographs cannot always convey. The three-dimensional positioning of individuals within communities that seem to have been organized according to principles that maximize the benefits of cooperation while minimizing the risks that came from increased interdependence. The sketches fill several pages of her field notebook, each drawing accompanied by measurements and observations that document the precise details of partnerships that might represent some of the most sophisticated forms of social organization that had evolved by the time the Great Dying began to transform the conditions for life on Earth. Thomas reviews his notes from the day's observations, comparing them with data from previous field seasons and with information from colleagues who are studying similar questions at sites around the world, looking for patterns that might indicate whether the innovations they are documenting represent local adaptations to particular environmental conditions or more widespread responses to global changes that were affecting marine ecosystems across the planet. The evidence suggests that partnerships between different species were becoming more common during the late Permian period, arrangements that allowed communities to maintain essential functions even as individual species faced increasing stress from changing ocean chemistry and rising temperatures. Yet the details of how these partnerships operated and why they were successful remain unclear, hidden in the spaces between what can be observed directly and what must be inferred from incomplete evidence preserved in stone. The complexity of the patterns they are uncovering seems to increase with each specimen they examine, revealing layers of organization that suggest these ancient communities had discovered forms of cooperation that were more sophisticated than anything that had existed before, innovations that were being tested and refined during the gradual environmental changes that preceded the acceleration of crisis that would define the Great Dying. Margaret opens her grandfather's field journal from 1924, its pages filled with observations about fossil collections from many of the same sites where she now conducts her research. Notes written in faded ink that document discoveries made almost a century ago by someone who shared her fascination with the stories preserved in limestone cliffs and ancient seafloors. His drawings show some of the same specimens she has been studying, though his focus was on identification and classification rather than the patterns of association that now seem so significant. Reminders that each generation of researchers brings different questions to the same evidence and discovers details that had been invisible to earlier observers who were looking for other kinds of information. The continuity between her work and his provides a sense of connection across time that mirrors the partnerships she has been documenting between ancient organisms, collaborations that persist across generations and create benefits that extend far beyond the immediate participants, strategies for survival and discovery that depend upon the patient accumulation of knowledge through many lifetimes of careful observation and gradual understanding. Thomas has been calculating the spacing between shells in the fossil assemblages they have been documenting, looking for mathematical relationships that might indicate these partnerships followed predictable patterns rather than forming through random associations, evidence that would suggest the evolution of instincts or behaviors that guided organisms toward beneficial arrangements even without conscious understanding of why such partnerships were advantageous. The measurements reveal surprisingly consistent distances between individuals of different species, spacing that seems optimized for sharing resources while avoiding competition, arrangements that maximize the benefits of cooperation while maintaining enough independence to allow individual organisms to pursue their own survival strategies when cooperative approaches proved inadequate. The precision of these spatial relationships seems remarkable when considered against the chaotic processes of burial and fossilization that created the conditions under which evidence of ancient partnerships could be preserved. Yet their consistency across multiple specimens suggests that the patterns are real rather than artifacts of preservation, evidence of sophisticated forms of social organization that were emerging during the final period of stability before the Great Dying transformed. The rules for survival on Earth. The darkness outside the study windows deepens as winter evening settles over the Peak District, creating conditions that make the warm light inside feel more intimate and focused. A circle of illumination that contains specimens and instruments and notebooks filled with observations about partnerships that flourished in ancient seas and that might provide insights about resilience and cooperation that could inform understanding of how communities respond to environmental challenges that exceed the capacity of individual adaptation. Margaret arranges the specimens they have examined today in sequence according to their age, creating a timeline that spans several million years of gradual change during the late Permian period, evidence of how partnerships evolved and became more sophisticated as environmental conditions became more challenging. innovations that were being tested and refined even before the global crisis reached its peak intensity. The sequence suggests something important about the relationship between stress and cooperation, the ways that moderate challenges can drive the evolution of partnerships that prove crucial when more severe tests arise, strategies that are developed during periods of gradual change, and that provide the foundation for survival when familiar patterns break down completely. Thomas closes his field notebook and carefully covers the microscope, his movements deliberate and respectful as he handles instruments that have revealed details about ancient worlds that seemed impossible to recover just a few decades ago, technologies that make visible the traces of partnerships that operated on scales too small to be detected without careful preparation and patient observation under precisely controlled conditions. The fossil specimens seem to hold light even after the lamps are turned off, their pale surfaces reflecting the last traces of illumination in ways that make them appear almost alive. Reminders that the communities they represent were indeed alive once, engaged in the daily work of survival and reproduction and cooperation that continues in different forms in the modern world, strategies that have been tested and refined through hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary experimentation and that persist in the partnerships between species that make contemporary ecosystems possible. The work they have been doing feels like a conversation with deep time, an exchange that requires patience and humility and the willingness to sit quietly with evidence that reveals its meaning slowly, like sediment settling through ancient water or starlight reaching Earth after journeys that began when the partnerships they are studying were still being formed by organisms that could not have imagined the world their innovations would help to create. Yet something larger seems to be taking shape in the patterns they have been documenting, connections that reach across millions of years and suggest forms of cooperation that were more ancient and more sophisticated than anyone had previously suspected, strategies that might hold keys to understanding not just how life survived its greatest crisis, but how the very nature of survival itself was transformed by communities that learned to work together when working alone was no longer sufficient for persistence in a world that was discovering new ways to test the limits of what living systems could endure and transcend. The work they have been doing feels like a conversation with deep time, an exchange that requires patience and humility and the willingness to sit quietly with evidence that reveals its meaning slowly, like sediment settling through ancient water or starlight reaching Earth after journeys that began when the partnerships they are studying were still being formed by organisms that could not have imagined the world their innovations would help to create. Yet something larger seems to be taking shape in the patterns they have been documenting, connections that reach across millions of years and suggest forms of cooperation that were more ancient and more sophisticated than anyone had previously suspected, strategies that might hold keys to understanding not just how life survived its greatest crisis, but how the very nature of survival itself was transformed by communities that learned to work together when working alone was no longer sufficient for persistence in a world that was discovering new ways to test the limits of what living systems could endure and transcend. Margaret wakes before dawn with a sudden clarity about the fossil patterns they have been studying, her mind carrying forward the work of interpretation that continued even during sleep, and she finds herself moving quietly through the cottage in the gray light that precedes sunrise, her slippers soft against the wooden floors as she returns to her study, where the specimens wait under their protective coverings like sleeping forms holding secrets that have remained hidden for 250 million years. The early morning silence feels different than the quiet of evening, charged with possibility as if the darkness itself has been working to reveal connections that daylight makes too obvious to notice. And when she uncovers the microscope and begins to examine yesterday's most promising specimen under the gentle illumination of her desk lamp, she sees something that makes her breath catch in her throat, a detail so subtle she had missed it before but that now seems unmistakable in its implications for understanding how ancient communities prepared for the crisis that would reshape life on Earth. Thomas arrives as the first pale light begins to filter through the frost-covered windows, carrying with him a thermos of coffee and the quiet anticipation that comes from knowing that important discoveries often emerge not from dramatic moments of revelation, but from the patient accumulation of small observations that suddenly align to reveal patterns that had been present all along but invisible until viewed from the right perspective. Margaret points to the specimen under the microscope without speaking, her finger trembling slightly as she indicates the area where organic material seems to connect not just individual shells but entire clusters of different species. networks that extend further than they had previously realized and that appear to link communities across significant distances of ancient seafloor, suggesting that cooperation during the late Permian period operated on scales that dwarf anything they had imagined possible for organisms without nervous systems or obvious methods of long-distance communication. The preserved organic material forms patterns that look almost like roots or blood vessels when viewed under high magnification, branching structures that seem to carry nutrients and information between communities that were separated by what would have been many meters of water and sediment, partnerships that created regional networks of mutual support that might have allowed entire ecosystems to respond collectively to environmental changes rather than requiring each local community to develop its own solutions to the challenges posed by rising temperatures and changing ocean chemistry. The implications of what they are seeing begin to unfold slowly as Thomas adjusts the microscope settings to reveal additional details. Chemical stains highlighting organic compounds that have survived the fossilization process and that seem to preserve evidence of metabolic processes that operated through the networks connecting different communities, biochemical conversations that allowed organisms separated by significant distances to share resources and coordinate their responses to environmental stress in ways that modern science is only beginning to understand even in contemporary ecosystems. Margaret reaches for her notebook and begins sketching the patterns they are observing, her drawings capturing spatial relationships that suggest these ancient networks were not random formations, but rather organized systems that developed according to principles that maximize the benefits of cooperation while distributing the risks associated with environmental change across multiple communities, strategies that allowed regional ecosystems to maintain stability even as local conditions fluctuated in response to the gradual onset of the crisis that would eventually become the Great Dying. The preservation of such extensive networks in the fossil record seems remarkable when considered against the destructive processes that normally eliminate all traces of soft tissue during fossilization. Yet these particular specimens seem to have been buried under conditions that were perfect for capturing evidence of partnerships that operated through mechanisms too delicate to survive under ordinary circumstances. Thomas has been photographing the network structures from multiple angles, documenting details that will allow them to create three-dimensional reconstructions of the partnerships they are discovering, maps of cooperation that extend through several layers of sediment and that seem to connect communities that existed across thousands of years of gradual environmental change during the late Permian period. The photographs reveal something unexpected about the organization of these networks, patterns that suggest they were not static structures but rather dynamic systems that changed over time in response to local conditions, partnerships that could be strengthened or weakened depending upon the availability of resources and the intensity of environmental stress, adaptive strategies that allowed ancient ecosystems to respond to change through cooperation rather than competition. Margaret compares the new photographs with images they took of specimens from different rock layers, looking for evidence of how these networks evolved over time, and she notices that the patterns become more complex and extensive in rocks that formed during periods when environmental conditions were becoming more challenging, suggesting that cooperation intensified as organisms faced increasing pressure from changing ocean chemistry and rising temperatures that preceded the acceleration of crisis that would define the Great Dying. The morning light grows stronger as they work, illuminating the cottage study with a clarity that makes the fossil specimens seem to glow with their own inner light, and Margaret realizes that they are looking at evidence of innovations that were far more sophisticated than anyone had previously suspected possible for organisms that lived so long ago. Partnerships that seem to anticipate the kinds of cooperation that would prove crucial for survival during the great crisis that lay ahead. The networks they are documenting appear to operate according to principles that are similar to those found in modern ecosystems. Yet they represent solutions that were discovered independently by communities that face challenges comparable to those confronting life today, strategies that emerged through millions of years of evolutionary experimentation and that were tested under conditions that pushed the boundaries of what living systems could endure. Thomas has been measuring the spacing and orientation of the network connections, looking for mathematical patterns that might reveal the rules governing how these partnerships were formed and maintained, and his data suggests that the networks were organized according to principles of efficiency and redundancy that maximized the benefits of cooperation while ensuring that the failure of any individual component would not collapse the entire system. Margaret opens her correspondence file and finds a letter from a colleague in China who has been studying similar rock formations from the same period, formations that preserve communities which seem to show comparable patterns of organization but that developed in different oceanic conditions on the far side of the ancient world, evidence that the innovations they are documenting might represent convergent evolution of cooperation strategies that emerged independently in different regions as communities faced similar environmental pressures during the gradual onset of the late Permian crisis. The Chinese specimens contain evidence of networks that seem even more extensive than those preserved in the British limestone. Partnerships that connected communities across what would have been hundreds of kilometers of ancient seafloor, suggesting that cooperation during this period operated on continental scales, and that regional ecosystems were linked by communication and resource-sharing systems that allowed them to respond collectively to environmental changes that affected entire ocean basins. The possibility that such vast networks of cooperation existed during the late Permian period raises profound questions about the sophistication of life on Earth long before the evolution of animals with complex nervous systems or obvious capacities for long-distance communication, strategies that seem to anticipate the kinds of planetary-scale coordination that modern ecological science recognizes as necessary for maintaining stable environmental conditions in the face of rapid global change. Thomas prepares chemical samples from the organic material preserved in the network structures, tests that will reveal the biochemical processes that operated through these ancient partnerships and that might provide insights into how communities shared resources and information across the extensive networks they are documenting, evidence that could illuminate the mechanisms that allowed cooperation to emerge as a dominant strategy for survival during one of the most challenging periods in the history of life on Earth. The chemical analysis requires equipment that is more sophisticated than what they have available in Margaret's cottage study. So they will need to send samples to specialized laboratories where precise measurements can reveal the molecular signatures of cooperation that operated through pathways too subtle to be detected by ordinary methods of fossil analysis. Margaret wraps the most promising specimens carefully for transport, her movements deliberate and reverent as she handles evidence of partnerships that flourished in ancient seas and that might provide crucial insights into how communities respond to environmental challenges that exceed the capacity of individual adaptation, strategies that were developed over millions of years of evolutionary experimentation, and that might offer guidance for understanding how modern ecosystems could maintain stability during periods of rapid change. The patterns they are discovering seem to suggest that the Great Dying was not simply a catastrophe that destroyed most of life on Earth, but rather a test that revealed which strategies for survival were most effective under extreme conditions. Innovations that had been developing over millions of years as communities learned to cooperate in response to gradually increasing environmental stress. Partnerships that proved crucial when the crisis reached its peak intensity and transformed the rules for existence in ways that eliminated most organisms that depended upon individual adaptation rather than collective response. Margaret has been reviewing her notes from previous field seasons, looking for evidence of similar networks in older rock formations, and she finds hints that cooperation might have been emerging as a survival strategy long before the late Permian period, partnerships that became more sophisticated and extensive as environmental conditions became more challenging, and that reached their peak development just before the Great Dying tested their effectiveness under the most severe conditions that life on Earth has ever faced. The possibility that cooperation evolved as a response to environmental stress over millions of years suggests that the strategies which proved crucial for survival during the Great Crisis were not sudden innovations but rather the culmination of long evolutionary processes that prepared life for challenges that would have been impossible to survive through individual adaptation alone. Thomas has been corresponding with researchers who study modern ecosystems that are facing rapid environmental change, sharing photographs and preliminary observations about the ancient networks they are discovering and asking whether similar patterns of cooperation might be emerging in contemporary communities that are responding to current challenges. Partnerships that could provide insights into how modern life might adapt to changing conditions through strategies that have deep roots in the evolutionary history of survival and resilience. The responses suggest that cooperation is indeed becoming more important in modern ecosystems that are experiencing environmental stress. Though the mechanisms are different from those that operated in ancient seas, adaptations that reflect the different physical and chemical constraints that govern life in terrestrial and marine environments, but that seem to follow similar principles of resource sharing and collective response to environmental challenge. The parallels between ancient and modern strategies for cooperation raise intriguing questions about whether life follows predictable patterns when faced with environmental crisis, Whether the solutions that emerged during the Great Dying represent universal principles of survival that could inform understanding of how communities might respond to contemporary challenges that seem to exceed the capacity of individual adaptation. Margaret steps outside into the morning air, the frost crunching softly under her feet as she walks through her garden toward the stone wall that separates her cottage from the fields where sheep graze among limestone outcrops that contain their own fossil treasures. Evidence of different experiments in cooperation and survival that played out across millions of years of evolutionary time, and she realizes that the networks they are discovering represent only a small fraction of the innovations that must have emerged during the late Permian period, partnerships that operated through mechanisms too subtle to be preserved in stone or that developed in environments that left few traces in the fossil record, but that might have been crucial for maintaining the basic chemistry and energy flows that allowed life to persist through the great crisis that transformed Earth. The morning sky holds the pale light of winter, clouds moving slowly across the distant hills in patterns that remind her of the networks they have been documenting in ancient limestone. Connections that link separate elements into larger systems that can respond to change through cooperation rather than competition. Strategies that operate on scales that encompass not just individual organisms or local communities, but entire regions and ecosystems that maintain stability through partnerships that distribute risks and share resources across vast networks of mutual dependence. Thomas joins her in the garden, carrying 2 cups of tea that steam in the cool air, and they stand quietly together looking across the valley toward the limestone cliffs where they have been conducting their research, layers of ancient seafloor that contain evidence of cooperation strategies that were more sophisticated than anyone had previously imagined possible, innovations that were tested and refined over millions of years, and that proved crucial for survival during the most severe environmental crisis in the history of life on Earth. The silence between them feels comfortable and contemplative, the quiet of researchers who have glimpsed patterns that connect their work to questions larger than any individual discovery, insights that seem to bridge the vast gulf of time that separates the present from ancient communities that face challenges comparable to those confronting modern life, but that found solutions through cooperation rather than the technological approaches that characterize contemporary responses to environmental change. The limestone cliffs catch the morning light in ways that emphasize their layered structure, each band representing thousands of years of gradual sedimentation that preserved snapshots of communities as they responded to changing conditions, evidence of innovations that emerged through patient experimentation across geological timescales, and that might provide guidance for understanding how cooperation could emerge as a dominant strategy for survival during periods when familiar approaches prove inadequate for maintaining stability in a rapidly changing world. Margaret and Thomas return to the cottage as the sun climbs higher, its rays slanting through the frost-covered windows and creating patterns of light and shadow that shift across the fossil specimens arranged on her desk. Reminders that understanding ancient communities requires patience and the willingness to examine evidence from multiple perspectives before drawing conclusions about processes that operated according to rules that may have been different from those that govern modern ecosystems, yet that seem to follow universal principles of cooperation and mutual support that transcend the specific conditions under which they evolved. The specimens seem to hold more secrets than they have yet revealed, patterns that become visible only under particular conditions of light and magnification, evidence of partnerships that operated through mechanisms so subtle they require the most sophisticated methods of analysis to detect. Yet their existence suggests that cooperation has ancient roots in the history of life, and that the strategies which proved crucial for survival during the Great Dying were not desperate improvisations but rather the culmination of long evolutionary processes that prepared life for challenges that would test the limits of what individual organisms could endure, and that would favor innovations that allowed communities to respond collectively to environmental changes that exceeded the capacity of any single species to survive through its own adaptations alone. The specimens seem to hold more secrets than they have yet revealed, patterns that become visible only under particular conditions of light and magnification, evidence of partnerships that operated through mechanisms so subtle they require the most sophisticated methods of analysis to detect. Yet their existence suggests that cooperation has ancient roots in the history of life, and that the strategies which proved crucial for survival during the Great Dying were not desperate improvisations but rather the culmination of long evolutionary processes that prepared life for challenges that would test the limits of what individual organisms could endure, and that would favor innovations that allowed communities to respond collectively to environmental changes that exceeded the capacity of any single species to survive through its own adaptations alone. Eleanor walks the coastal paths near her home in Cornwall, her footsteps following routes that fishermen have used for generations to reach the harbors where their boats rest between tides. And she carries with her a leather satchel filled with sketches of tidal pools where modern communities demonstrate the same principles of cooperation that Margaret and Thomas have been discovering in ancient limestone: partnerships between sea anemones and crabs, between algae and mollusks, between different species of barnacles that share the work of filtering nutrients from water that rises and falls according to rhythms that have persisted for millions of years. The wind moves across the water in patterns that create waves which break against the rocks in ways that seem almost musical, a constant percussion that accompanies her observations of how contemporary organisms respond to the stress of changing tides, fluctuating temperatures, and the seasonal variations in food availability that require them to cooperate in order to maintain stable communities in environments that would be hostile to any individual trying to survive alone. Eleanor has been corresponding with Margaret for 15 years, ever since she read a paper about fossil communities that seemed to parallel the modern partnerships she studies in the intertidal zones where land meets sea, and where the daily rhythm of exposure and submersion creates conditions that favor organisms capable of sharing resources and coordinating their responses to environmental change. Her letters describe communities of mussels that seem to communicate through chemical signals that help them coordinate their feeding activities, ensuring that all members of a cluster receive adequate nutrition, even when the availability of plankton varies with the changing seasons. Strategies that echo the ancient networks Margaret has been documenting in limestone formations that preserve evidence of similar cooperation from seas that existed 250 million years ago. The parallels between modern and ancient partnerships suggest that cooperation emerges as a survival strategy whenever organisms face environmental challenges that exceed their individual capacity for adaptation, innovations that develop through long periods of evolutionary experimentation, and that prove their effectiveness when tested by crises that eliminate communities dependent upon competition rather than mutual support. Samuel tends his research garden in the Cotswolds, where he has been studying the relationships between plants and the soil organisms that help them extract nutrients from earth that has been farmed for thousands of years. Partnerships that operate through fungal networks that connect individual plants into larger systems capable of sharing water and minerals across significant distances, allowing entire communities to respond collectively to changes in rainfall and temperature that would challenge any single plant trying to survive through its own resources alone. The garden follows the contours of hills that rise and fall like frozen waves, their slopes covered with stone walls that mark field boundaries established centuries ago, but that seem temporary when considered against the background of the geological processes that shaped this landscape over millions of years, forces that continue to operate through the patient work of wind and water moving soil and stone according to patterns that connect the present to deep time. Samuel has noticed that the most resilient plant communities in his garden are those that maintain the greatest diversity of partnerships with soil organisms, relationships that create redundancy and flexibility that allow the entire system to continue functioning even when particular species are stressed by drought or disease, strategies that seem to mirror the ancient cooperation networks that Margaret and Thomas have been discovering in fossil assemblages from the late Permian period. Eleanor's work in the tidal zones has revealed something unexpected about how modern communities respond to environmental stress. Evidence that partnerships between different species often become stronger during periods when conditions are most challenging, relationships that might remain dormant during times of abundance but that activate when resources become scarce, or when environmental conditions exceed the normal range of variation that organisms can handle through individual adaptation. She has documented cases where sea anemones that normally compete for space and food begin to share resources when storms or unusual tides create conditions that threaten the survival of entire communities. Behaviors that suggest cooperation is not just an evolutionary strategy, but also a behavioral response that can emerge rapidly when circumstances demand collective action rather than individual struggle. The observations parallel reports from Margaret's research about ancient communities that seem to have developed more extensive cooperation networks during periods when environmental conditions were becoming more challenging, partnerships that intensified as the gradual onset of the Great Dying created pressure for innovations that would prove crucial when the crisis reached its peak intensity. Samuel corresponds with researchers around the world who study similar partnerships between plants and soil organisms, exchanges that have revealed that the fungal networks he observes in his Cotswolds garden exist in forests and grasslands across every continent, partnerships that operate according to similar principles despite developing in very different environments and climate conditions, evidence that cooperation through underground networks represents a universal strategy that has been discovered independently by plant communities facing various forms of environmental challenge. His letters include photographs of fungal networks that have been made visible through special staining techniques, images that show thread-like connections extending between individual plants like the organic networks that Thomas has been documenting in ancient limestone, structures that carry nutrients and information across distances that would have seemed impossible for organisms without obvious methods of long-distance communication. The fungal networks seem to operate as communication systems that allow plant communities to coordinate their responses to environmental changes, sharing information about water availability, nutrient levels, and the presence of threats in ways that benefit entire ecosystems rather than just individual organisms. Eleanor often walks the coastal paths during the hour before sunset, when the light falls across the water at angles that reveal details in the tidal pools that are invisible during other times of day, patterns of cooperation that become apparent only under particular conditions of illumination, reminders that understanding natural communities requires patience and the willingness to observe from multiple perspectives before drawing conclusions about the relationships that allow organisms to survive in environments that present constant challenges to their persistence. The evening light creates reflections on the water surface that seem to connect individual pools into larger patterns, visual metaphors for the partnerships she has been documenting between organisms that might appear to be isolated when viewed casually but that prove to be components of larger systems when examined with sufficient care and attention to detail. The sound of waves against the rocks provides a constant background that seems to emphasize the rhythmic nature of cooperation in these communities, partnerships that pulse with the tides and seasons in ways that maintain stability through cycles of stress and recovery that have persisted for thousands of years. Samuel has been mapping the fungal networks in his research garden using techniques that reveal the underground architecture of cooperation that supports the visible communities of plants and flowers that most observers notice when they visit these ancient Cotswolds fields, hidden partnerships that operate through soil systems that took centuries to develop their current complexity, and that represent collaborations between organisms that might never encounter each other directly yet that depend upon each other for survival in ways that create benefits extending far beyond the immediate participants. His maps show networks that extend across entire hillsides, connections that link individual plants into regional systems capable of sharing resources and information across landscapes that encompass multiple soil types and microclimates, partnerships that allow communities to maintain stability even when local conditions fluctuate beyond the range that any single organism could tolerate through its own adaptations alone. The mapping process requires careful excavation that reveals the delicate structure of fungal threads without disturbing the relationships they support, work that proceeds slowly through seasons of patient observation and documentation that builds understanding gradually rather than through dramatic moments of discovery. Eleanor has noticed that the cooperation she observes in modern tidal pools seems to follow patterns that are similar to those Margaret has been documenting in ancient limestone. Partnerships that begin with simple resource sharing between neighboring organisms and that gradually develop into more complex networks that can coordinate the activities of entire communities. Innovations that emerge through trial and error across many generations and that prove their effectiveness when tested by environmental challenges that exceed the capacity of individual adaptation. Her sketches show arrangements of organisms that echo the fossil patterns Thomas has been photographing, clusters of different species that seem to be positioned in ways that maximize the benefits of cooperation while minimizing the risks associated with increased interdependence, strategies that operate according to principles of efficiency and redundancy that have been discovered independently by communities separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary time. The consistency of these patterns across such vast temporal distances suggests that cooperation follows universal rules that transcend the specific conditions under which particular partnerships evolve, principles that reflect fundamental aspects of how living systems respond to environmental challenge and that might provide insights into how communities could maintain stability during periods of rapid change. Samuel's research has revealed that the fungal networks he studies can persist through seasonal changes that would eliminate most of the plants they connect, underground partnerships that maintain their structure through winter dormancy, and that facilitate the rapid recovery of plant communities when growing conditions improve with the return of spring warmth and longer days, strategies that seem to echo the persistence mechanisms that allowed some ancient communities to survive through the worst periods of the Great Dying and to serve as foundations for the recovery that gradually restored complexity to ecosystems that had been simplified by the Great Crisis. The fungal threads seem to preserve information about successful strategies for survival that can be shared with new plants that establish themselves in the garden. Knowledge that is transmitted through chemical signals that help newcomers integrate into existing partnerships rather than requiring them to develop survival strategies independently through the slower process of individual adaptation to local conditions. The possibility that underground networks can serve as repositories of survival knowledge raises intriguing questions about how information might have been preserved and transmitted through the crisis periods that eliminated most visible forms of life, but that might have allowed hidden partnerships to maintain the basic functions necessary for eventual recovery. Eleanor spends her winter evenings reading papers about ancient ecosystems, looking for connections between the modern partnerships she observes in tidal pools and the fossil evidence that Margaret and Thomas have been uncovering in limestone formations from the late Permian period, similarities that suggest cooperation has been a consistent strategy for survival throughout the history of life on Earth, but that becomes particularly important during periods when environmental conditions challenge the effectiveness of individual adaptation. Her correspondence with Margaret includes detailed comparisons between modern and ancient patterns of organization, observations that reveal how partnerships between different species follow similar principles despite developing under very different environmental conditions and in response to different types of stress, evidence that cooperation emerges as a natural response to challenges that exceed the capacity of individual organisms to solve through their own resources alone. The letters flow between Cornwall and the Peak District like water following ancient channels, carrying ideas and observations that gradually build understanding of patterns that operate across scales of time and space that dwarf human experience yet that seem to follow rules that can be detected through patient observation and careful comparison of evidence from different sources and different periods in the deep history of life. Samuel has been collaborating with Margaret and Thomas on studies that compare the chemical signatures of modern fungal networks with the organic compounds preserved in ancient limestone, analysis that reveals similarities in the biochemical processes that operate through partnerships separated by hundreds of millions of years, evidence that cooperation utilizes similar molecular mechanisms regardless of when and where it evolves, strategies that seem to represent optimal solutions to the challenge of coordinating activities between organisms that lack obvious methods of direct communication. The chemical analysis requires sophisticated equipment that can detect molecular signatures in quantities so small they would have been impossible to measure just a few decades ago. Techniques that make visible the biochemical conversations that allow cooperation to operate through pathways too subtle to be detected by ordinary observation. Evidence of partnerships that function through mechanisms that operate below the threshold of visibility yet that create effects that can be observed at the scale of entire communities and ecosystems. The molecular similarities between ancient and modern cooperation suggest that life has discovered fundamental principles of partnership that transcend the specific conditions under which particular collaborations evolve, strategies that represent universal approaches to the challenge of maintaining stability in environments that present constant threats to individual survival. Eleanor and Samuel have been planning to visit Margaret's research sites in the Peak District during the coming spring, when the limestone cliffs will be illuminated by the longer days and warmer light that reveal details invisible during the shorter days of winter, observations that could provide new insights into the connections between modern and ancient strategies for cooperation and survival that might inform understanding of how communities respond to environmental challenges that exceed the capacity of individual adaptation. Their collaboration represents its own form of partnership, researchers from different disciplines sharing observations and insights that create understanding greater than any of them could achieve through individual work alone. Strategies that echo the cooperation they are studying in both modern and ancient communities. Innovations that emerge when challenges require collective response rather than individual solutions. The planned fieldwork will bring together expertise in modern ecology, paleontology, and soil science in ways that might reveal patterns that have been invisible to researchers working within single disciplines, partnerships that could illuminate connections between past and present that provide guidance for understanding how life responds to the kinds of environmental challenges that characterize both ancient crises and contemporary changes, strategies for survival that have deep roots in the history of cooperation and that continue to operate through mechanisms that connect all living systems across vast expanses of time and space. Their collaboration represents its own form of partnership, researchers from different disciplines sharing observations and insights that create understanding greater than any of them could achieve through individual work alone. Strategies that echo the cooperation they are studying in both modern and ancient communities. Innovations that emerge when challenges require collective response rather than individual solutions. And the planned fieldwork will bring together expertise in modern ecology, paleontology, and soil science in ways that might reveal patterns that have been invisible to researchers working within single disciplines, partnerships that could illuminate connections between past and present that provide guidance for understanding how life responds to the kinds of environmental challenges that characterize both ancient crises and contemporary changes, strategies for survival that have deep roots in the history of cooperation and that continue to operate through mechanisms that connect all living systems across vast expanses of time and space. Margaret sits in her study as evening light fades across the Peak District, considering the different ways that the ancient cooperation networks they have been documenting might be interpreted, each possibility opening new questions about what survival might have meant for communities that faced the greatest crisis in the history of life on Earth. And she finds herself wondering whether the partnerships preserved in limestone represent desperate adaptations to catastrophic change or whether they might have been refinements of strategies that had been developing for millions of years before the Great Dying began, innovations that prepared life for challenges that would have been impossible to survive through individual effort alone. The fossil patterns could suggest that cooperation emerged as a response to scarcity, organisms learning to share resources when competition became too costly for communities that were already stressed by changing environmental conditions. Or they might indicate that partnerships developed as ways of sharing information about environmental changes, allowing communities to respond collectively to threats that individual organisms would have detected too late to implement effective survival strategies. Thomas has been considering whether the networks they have discovered might represent something even more fundamental than resource sharing or communication, partnerships that could have allowed ancient communities to modify their local environments in ways that created refuges from the global changes that were transforming ocean chemistry and atmospheric composition during the late Permian period, innovations that might have given cooperating communities advantages that were unavailable to organisms that relied upon individual adaptation to changing conditions. The organic connections between different species could have facilitated the creation of microenvironments where older approaches to survival could persist even as larger regional systems were being disrupted by rising temperatures and increasing acidity. Strategies that might explain how some forms of life managed to survive through the worst periods of the Great Dying, and to serve as foundations for the recovery that gradually restored complexity to ecosystems that had been simplified by the crisis. The networks might have operated as early warning systems that allowed communities to prepare for environmental changes before they became severe enough to threaten survival. Partnerships that shared information about subtle shifts in water chemistry or temperature that could indicate the approach of more serious disruptions, giving cooperating organisms time to adjust their metabolism or behavior in ways that would prove crucial when crisis conditions intensified. Eleanor walks the Cornish coastline during a winter storm, watching how modern tidal pool communities respond to conditions that test their resilience. And she observes behaviors that might illuminate how ancient partnerships functioned during periods of environmental stress, organisms that seem to alter their normal patterns of feeding and reproduction in ways that prioritize the survival of entire communities over the immediate needs of individual organisms, strategies that suggest cooperation can emerge rapidly when circumstances demand collective response rather than individual competition. The waves crash against the rocks with unusual force, creating conditions that would be catastrophic for isolated organisms but that seem to trigger cooperative behaviors in communities that have developed partnerships for sharing the work of maintaining stable conditions in environments that fluctuate beyond the normal range of variation that any single species could handle through its own adaptations alone. She notices that some communities seem to anticipate the arrival of storms, altering their behavior in ways that suggest they are responding to environmental cues that are too subtle for casual observation to detect. early warning systems that might operate through chemical signals or other forms of communication that allow entire communities to prepare for challenges before they become severe enough to threaten survival. Samuel observes similar patterns in his Cotswolds garden during periods when unusual weather creates stress for the plant communities he studies. And he notes that the fungal networks that connect individual plants seem to become more active during times when conditions are challenging, partnerships that might facilitate the rapid sharing of resources and information in ways that allow entire communities to respond collectively to environmental changes that would overwhelm individual organisms, trying to adapt through their own resources alone. The underground networks seem to operate as buffering systems that moderate the effects of environmental fluctuations, creating stability that allows plant communities to maintain their essential functions even when surface conditions vary beyond the normal range that individual species can tolerate. Strategies that might have operated in similar ways during ancient periods of environmental stress, when cooperation provided advantages that were unavailable to organisms that depended upon individual adaptation to changing conditions. He wonders whether the fungal networks might also serve as memory systems that preserve information about successful responses to past challenges, biochemical libraries that can be accessed by future generations of plants when similar conditions arise, knowledge that is transmitted through chemical signals rather than through the genetic inheritance that operates through individual lineages. Margaret has been reconsidering the timing of the cooperation networks they have discovered, wondering whether the partnerships might have emerged not as responses to the Great Dying itself, but as preparations for challenges that communities somehow anticipated long before the crisis reached its peak intensity. Innovations that developed during the gradual environmental changes that preceded the acceleration of transformation that would define the late Permian extinction event. The fossil evidence suggests that the most extensive networks formed during periods when environmental conditions were becoming more variable, but had not yet reached crisis levels. Partnerships that might have developed as insurance against future disruptions, rather than as emergency responses to immediate threats, strategies that positioned cooperating communities to survive challenges that had not yet materialized, but that were somehow anticipated by organisms that possessed sensory capabilities or information processing abilities that modern science does not yet fully understand. The possibility that ancient communities could anticipate environmental changes raises questions about the forms of intelligence that might have operated through cooperative networks, collective processing of environmental information that allowed entire ecosystems to respond to subtle patterns that predicted larger disruptions, early warning systems that operated through mechanisms that connected individual organisms into larger sensing and responding systems. Thomas considers whether the ancient networks might have functioned as distributed nervous systems that allowed communities to process environmental information in ways that individual organisms could never achieve, partnerships that created emergent intelligence that operated at the scale of entire ecosystems rather than individual species, collective cognition that might have allowed cooperating communities to detect and respond to environmental changes that would have been invisible to organisms that relied upon their own sensory systems and individual processing capabilities. The organic connections preserved in fossil assemblages could represent communication pathways that carried not just nutrients and waste products but also information about environmental conditions, data that was processed collectively by entire communities in ways that created understanding and response capabilities that transcended what any individual organism could achieve through its own neural or biochemical systems. The networks might have operated as primitive forms of ecosystem-level intelligence that allowed cooperating communities to navigate environmental challenges through collective sensing and decision-making, innovations that might have provided the foundation for the kinds of planetary-scale coordination that would prove crucial for surviving the global disruptions of the Great Dying. Eleanor has been studying how modern communities coordinate their responses to environmental changes, looking for evidence of the kinds of collective intelligence that might have operated through ancient cooperation networks, and she observes behaviors that suggest individual organisms can participate in larger sensing and responding systems that operate through chemical communication and behavioral coordination rather than through the neural networks that characterize individual intelligence. In more complex animals, the tidal pool communities she studies seem to respond to environmental changes as unified systems, with individual organisms altering their behavior in ways that create benefits for entire communities even when such changes might seem disadvantageous from the perspective of individual survival. Strategies that suggest forms of collective decision-making that operate through mechanisms that distribute intelligence across entire networks rather than concentrating it in individual organisms. She wonders whether such collective intelligence might have been more common in ancient ecosystems before the evolution of complex nervous systems created alternative approaches to environmental sensing and response, innovations that might have represented the dominant form of intelligence on Earth during the Permian period when the cooperation networks Margaret and Thomas are studying reached their peak development. Samuel has noticed that the plant communities in his garden seem to make collective decisions about when to begin growing in spring and when to prepare for winter dormancy, timing that appears to be coordinated through the underground fungal networks that connect individual plants into larger information processing systems, partnerships that might allow entire communities to respond to environmental cues that are too subtle for individual organisms to detect or interpret effectively. The coordination of seasonal timing across entire plant communities suggests forms of collective sensing that operate through chemical signals carried by fungal networks, information processing that allows communities to respond to environmental patterns that operate on larger spatial and temporal scales than individual organisms could monitor through their own sensory capabilities, strategies that might have operated in similar ways during ancient periods when cooperation networks facilitated community-level responses to environmental changes that would have overwhelmed individual adaptation mechanisms. He considers whether the underground networks might also coordinate responses to longer-term environmental changes, collective sensing systems that could detect gradual shifts in climate or soil chemistry that would be invisible to individual plants, but that could be perceived by communities that possess distributed sensing capabilities operating through fungal partnerships that connected individual organisms into larger environmental monitoring systems. Margaret wonders whether the cooperation networks they have discovered might represent early experiments in what could be called ecosystem engineering, partnerships that allowed ancient communities to modify their environments in ways that created more favorable conditions for survival, innovations that might have operated through collective alteration of local chemistry, temperature, or other environmental factors that individual organisms could not have modified through their own activities alone. The extensive networks preserved in limestone formations could have facilitated community-level projects that created refuges from global environmental changes, cooperative modification of local conditions that maintained habitable environments even as larger regional systems were being disrupted by the forces that would eventually culminate in the Great Dying, strategies that might have allowed some communities to persist through the worst periods of the crisis by creating their own favorable conditions rather than depending upon individual adaptation to increasingly hostile environments. The possibility that ancient communities possessed ecosystem engineering capabilities raises questions about the extent to which cooperation might have allowed life to actively participate in maintaining planetary conditions suitable for survival, partnerships that operated as early forms of planetary-scale environmental management that helped maintain the conditions necessary for life to persist through crisis periods that would have been catastrophic for organisms that depended entirely upon individual adaptation to environmental change. Thomas has been exploring whether the ancient networks might have operated as early forms of what modern science calls symbiosis, partnerships that created new forms of organisms through cooperation rather than through the genetic inheritance that operates through individual lineages, innovations that might have allowed ancient communities to develop capabilities that were unavailable to any individual species but that emerged from collective activities that transcended the boundaries between different types of organisms. The fossil evidence suggests that some of the most successful communities during the late Permian period were those that included organisms from very different evolutionary backgrounds, partnerships that might have created hybrid systems possessing capabilities that were greater than the sum of their individual components, collective organisms that could respond to environmental challenges through strategies that required cooperation between species that had very different strengths and weaknesses. The networks could have facilitated the emergence of what might be called superorganisms that possessed collective intelligence, distributed metabolism, and cooperative reproduction systems that operated at the scale of entire communities rather than individual species, innovations that might have provided the foundation for survival strategies that were unavailable to organisms that remained dependent upon individual capabilities rather than collective cooperation. Eleanor considers whether modern ecosystems might still contain remnants of the kinds of cooperation networks that Margaret and Thomas are studying in ancient limestone, partnerships that operate through mechanisms that are too subtle for ordinary observation to detect but that might become visible through the kinds of careful analysis that reveal the organic connections preserved in fossil assemblages, strategies that might represent continuations of ancient approaches to survival that have persisted through hundreds of millions of years of environmental change. She has begun to notice patterns in modern tidal pool communities that seem to echo the fossil arrangements documented in Permian limestone, spatial relationships between different species that might indicate the presence of communication networks that operate through chemical signals or other forms of cooperation that create benefits for entire communities even though the individual connections are too delicate to be observed directly, partnerships that might have deep roots in evolutionary history and that continue to operate through mechanisms that connect modern ecosystems to the survival strategies that proved crucial during ancient periods of environmental crisis. Samuel wonders whether the fungal networks he studies in his Cotswolds garden might represent modern versions of the ancient cooperation systems that allowed life to survive through the Great Dying, partnerships that continue to operate according to principles that were discovered during the most challenging periods in the history of life on Earth, innovations that have been refined and adapted to contemporary conditions but that retain the essential characteristics that made cooperation crucial for survival during ancient crises. The underground networks that connect modern plant communities seem to possess many of the same features that Margaret and Thomas have documented in fossil assemblages: distributed sensing capabilities, resource-sharing mechanisms, and communication systems that allow individual organisms to participate in larger collective activities that create benefits unavailable to organisms that rely upon individual adaptation alone, strategies that suggest the principles of cooperation that emerged during the Permian period continue to operate in modern ecosystems through partnerships that maintain the stability and resilience that life requires for persistence through periods of environmental change. Margaret sits quietly in her study as darkness settles over the Peak District, considering the different ways that cooperation might have operated during the ancient world and wondering whether the partnerships preserved in limestone represent strategies that were unique to the environmental conditions of the late Permian period, or whether they might indicate universal principles of survival that emerge whenever life faces challenges that exceed the capacity of individual adaptation. Innovations that could provide guidance for understanding how communities might respond to contemporary environmental changes that seem to require collective solutions rather than individual approaches to the challenge of maintaining stability in a rapidly changing world. The fossil networks they have been studying seem to suggest that cooperation emerges as a natural response to environmental stress. Yet their sophistication and extent indicate that these partnerships were not desperate improvisations but rather sophisticated strategies that had been developing for millions of years before the Great Dying tested their effectiveness under the most severe conditions that life on Earth has ever faced, innovations that might reveal fundamental principles about how living systems organize themselves to survive challenges that threaten the continuation of life itself. And as she contemplates the implications of their discoveries, she finds herself wondering whether the ancient communities that developed these remarkable partnerships possessed forms of wisdom about survival and cooperation that modern life has forgotten, strategies that might hold keys to understanding not just how life survived its greatest crisis but how the very experience of survival might have transformed the consciousness that guides living systems in their ongoing exploration of what it means to exist together in a world that is always, in its own mysterious way, testing the limits of what life can endure and teaching those who listen carefully about the hidden strengths that emerge when individual survival becomes impossible and collective wisdom offers the only pathway through challenges that seem too great for any single being to face alone. As she contemplates the implications of their discoveries, she finds herself wondering whether the ancient communities that developed these remarkable partnerships possessed forms of wisdom about survival and cooperation that modern life has forgotten, strategies that might hold keys to understanding not just how life survived its greatest crisis but how the very experience of survival might have transformed the consciousness that guides living systems in their ongoing exploration of what it means to exist together in a world that is always, in its own mysterious way, testing the limits of what life can endure and teaching those who listen carefully about the hidden strengths that emerge when individual survival becomes impossible and collective wisdom offers the only pathway through challenges that seem too great for any single being to face alone. Margaret walks slowly through her cottage in the quiet hours after midnight, her bare feet soft against the wooden floors that have supported decades of late-night contemplation, and she moves among the specimens and notebooks and maps that contain the accumulated evidence of a lifetime spent learning to listen to stories that stones tell about communities that learned to care for each other when the familiar world began to forget how to sustain the patterns of life that had flourished for millions of years. The lamplight creates circles of warm illumination that seem to hold space for thinking about time in ways that daily life rarely permits, hours that flow like still water between the demands of daylight and the rest that comes with dawn. Moments when the mind can settle into the patient rhythms required for understanding processes that operated across geological ages and that continue to shape the possibilities for existence in ways that connect every living moment to the deep history of survival and adaptation that flows beneath the surface of ordinary experience. Thomas sits at his desk in Edinburgh, the window open to the night air that carries the scent of rain from the hills surrounding the city, and he arranges photographs of fossil specimens in sequences that tell stories about partnerships that developed over millions of years, relationships that began with simple resource sharing and gradually evolved into networks of cooperation sophisticated enough to allow entire ecosystems to respond collectively to environmental changes that would have overwhelmed any individual organism trying to adapt through its own resources alone. The photographs seem to hold light even in the darkness, their pale surfaces reflecting the desk lamp in ways that make the ancient creatures appear almost alive. Reminders that the communities he studies were indeed alive once, engaged in the daily work of finding food and shelter and partners for reproduction. Ordinary activities that were transformed by crisis into extraordinary innovations that would prove crucial for the continuation of life on Earth. He handles each photograph with the careful attention of someone who understands that these images contain information that exists nowhere else. Evidence of partnerships that operated through mechanisms so delicate they required perfect conditions for preservation. Chances so rare that their survival across hundreds of millions of years seems like a form of grace that allows the present to remain connected to the deep past through threads of understanding that can only be maintained by patient attention to details that might otherwise be lost to the inevitable erosion of memory and time. Eleanor writes letters by candlelight in her cottage overlooking the Cornish coast. The flame steady in the still air as she describes observations about modern communities that seem to echo the ancient partnerships Margaret and Thomas have been discovering in limestone formations, similarities that suggest cooperation follows universal principles that transcend the specific conditions under which particular relationships evolve, strategies that emerge whenever organisms face challenges that require collective wisdom rather than individual strength for survival and flourishing. The candle flame creates shadows that shift and dance across the pages as she writes, movements that remind her of the tidal pools where she conducts her research, communities that pulse with the rhythms of cooperation and mutual care that have persisted for thousands of years, partnerships that demonstrate the continuity between ancient and modern approaches to the challenge of creating stable relationships in environments that are constantly changing in response to forces that operate on scales larger than any individual organism can perceive or influence through its own efforts alone. Her words flow across the paper like water finding its path through landscape, thoughts that connect observations from different times and places into patterns that reveal something important about the nature of care itself, the ways that organisms learn to attend to each other's needs in relationships that create benefits extending far beyond the immediate participants to encompass entire communities and ecosystems that depend upon such partnerships for their stability and resilience. Samuel tends his garden under starlight, the earth cool beneath his hands as he works among plants that are connected by underground networks invisible to casual observation, but that operate as communication systems allowing entire communities to share information about environmental conditions, changes in weather patterns, and the availability of resources that determine whether individual organisms will thrive or struggle through the seasons that mark the passage of time in the slow rhythms that govern the natural world. The darkness seems to amplify his awareness of the subtle processes that operate below ground, partnerships between plants and fungi that continue their work of nutrient exchange and information sharing even during the hours when photosynthesis cannot occur, collaborations that demonstrate the 24-hour nature of cooperation in communities that have learned to support each other through all the different phases of daily and seasonal cycles that create the temporal framework within which life organizes its activities. His hands move gently through soil that contains the accumulated work of countless generations of organisms that have lived and died and contributed their substance to the complex chemistry that supports contemporary communities, reminders that the garden exists as part of larger cycles of growth and decay that connect the present moment to deep history through pathways that operate below the threshold of ordinary awareness, but that become visible to those who learn to pay attention to the subtle signs of relationship and interdependence that characterize healthy ecosystems. Margaret returns to her study and opens a field notebook from 30 years ago, its pages filled with sketches and observations from her early career when she was just beginning to notice patterns in fossil assemblages that seemed to suggest cooperation between ancient organisms, relationships that most researchers dismissed as coincidental arrangements rather than evidence of genuine partnership between different species. Yet she persisted in documenting these patterns because something about them felt important even when she could not articulate why they captured her attention in ways that more obvious fossils did not. The notebook falls open to a drawing of brachiopod shells arranged in a circle, their orientation suggesting they had been filtering nutrients from the same small volume of ancient seawater. And beside the drawing she wrote questions about whether such arrangements might indicate cooperation rather than competition, possibilities that seemed almost impossible at the time, but that now feel prescient in light of the extensive networks she and Thomas have been discovering in formations that preserve communities from the same period in Earth's history. The handwriting belongs to a younger version of herself, someone who was just learning to trust her intuition about patterns that seemed too subtle to be significant yet that persisted across multiple sites and different rock formations, observations that required decades of patient accumulation before their importance became clear, reminders that understanding deep time requires forms of attention that operate on timescales that exceed individual careers and that depend upon the willingness to pursue questions even when their answers remain hidden in the spaces between what can be observed directly and what must be inferred from incomplete evidence preserved in stone. Thomas has been reading letters from researchers around the world who have begun to notice similar patterns in their own fossil collections, observations that were previously dismissed as artifacts of preservation, but that now seem to indicate widespread cooperation between ancient organisms, partnerships that operated according to principles that are only beginning to be understood by contemporary science, innovations that suggest the sophistication of life on Earth was far greater during the late Permian period than anyone had previously imagined possible for communities that existed before the evolution of complex nervous systems or obvious methods of long-distance communication. The letters arrive slowly through postal systems that operate according to human timescales, yet they carry information about discoveries that connect the present to events that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago, evidence that cooperation has ancient roots in the history of life and that the strategies which proved crucial for survival during the Great Dying were not desperate improvisations but rather sophisticated approaches to collective survival that had been developing for geological ages before they were tested by the greatest crisis that life on Earth has ever faced. He files each letter carefully in folders organized by geographic region and geological age, creating an archive that documents the gradual emergence of understanding about cooperation in deep time, recognition that is spreading slowly through the scientific community as researchers learn to look for evidence that was always present, but that required new ways of seeing to become visible, patterns that reveal themselves only to those who approach ancient communities with the patience required for recognizing relationships that operated through mechanisms too delicate to be preserved under ordinary circumstances. Eleanor walks the coastal paths in the hour before dawn, when the air is still and the water reflects the first pale light of approaching sunrise, conditions that reveal details in the tidal pools that are invisible during other times of day, partnerships between organisms that become apparent only under particular conditions of illumination and attention, reminders that understanding natural communities requires the willingness to observe at different times and from multiple perspectives, before drawing conclusions about the relationships that allow life to persist in environments that present constant challenges to individual survival. The sound of her footsteps on the rocky path creates a gentle rhythm that seems to match the pulse of waves against the shore, natural percussion that accompanies her observations of communities that demonstrate the continuity between ancient and modern approaches to cooperation, strategies that have persisted across hundreds of millions of years of environmental change because they represent fundamental solutions to challenges that arise whenever organisms must learn to live together in spaces that provide limited resources and that require careful coordination to maintain the stability necessary for long-term survival. She carries a notebook that contains years of observations about the seasonal changes in partnership patterns, documentation that reveals how cooperation intensifies during periods of environmental stress and becomes more relaxed during times of abundance, evidence that organisms possess behavioral flexibility that allows them to adjust their level of interdependence in response to changing conditions, adaptations that might explain how ancient communities were able to develop the sophisticated networks that Margaret and Thomas have been discovering in limestone formations that preserve evidence of cooperation that reached unprecedented levels of complexity during the environmental changes that preceded the Great Dying. Samuel prepares tea in his kitchen as morning light begins to filter through windows that overlook the Cotswolds Hills. His movements slow and deliberate as he follows rituals that connect the beginning of each day to the larger cycles of care and attention that characterize his research into the underground networks that support the plant communities he studies in his garden. Partnerships that operate through fungal connections invisible to surface observation, but that create the foundation for all the visible beauty that emerges during growing seasons when cooperation between different species allows entire landscapes to flourish in ways that would be impossible if individual plants were forced to extract all their nutrients from soil through their own root systems alone. The steam from his teacup creates temporary patterns in the cool morning air, ephemeral forms that appear and disappear like thoughts about the relationship between individual organisms and the larger systems they participate in. Reminders that understanding cooperation requires attention to processes that operate on multiple scales simultaneously, from the molecular exchanges that occur between plant roots and fungal partners to the landscape-level coordination that allows entire ecosystems to respond collectively to seasonal changes and longer-term environmental shifts that affect the availability of water, nutrients, and other resources necessary for community survival. He sits quietly at his kitchen table, watching the light change as the sun rises above the hills, and contemplates the continuity between the underground partnerships he studies and the ancient networks that Margaret and Thomas have been documenting in fossil assemblages. Connections that suggest cooperation represents a fundamental strategy for survival that has been discovered and rediscovered by countless generations of organisms facing challenges that exceed their individual capacity for adaptation, innovations that point toward universal principles of mutual care that transcend the specific mechanisms through which particular partnerships operate. Margaret stands at her study window watching the sunrise illuminate the limestone cliffs where she has conducted research for more than 2 decades. Layers of ancient seafloor that contain evidence of communities that learned to care for each other during one of the most challenging periods in the history of life on Earth. Innovations that allowed cooperation to emerge as a dominant strategy for survival when individual adaptation proved inadequate for persistence through environmental changes that transformed the basic conditions for existence on this planet. The morning light reveals details in the rock formations that are invisible under artificial illumination, subtle patterns of layering that represent thousands of years of gradual sedimentation, processes that preserved snapshots of ancient communities as they responded to changing conditions through partnerships that became more sophisticated and extensive as environmental challenges intensified. Evidence that cooperation was not a response to catastrophe, but rather a long-term strategy that was tested and refined across millions of years before it proved crucial for survival during the crisis that would define the Great Dying. She holds a piece of limestone that contains evidence of some of the most complex cooperation networks they have discovered, fossil assemblages that suggest ancient communities possessed forms of collective intelligence that operated through organic connections between different species, partnerships that created benefits extending far beyond the immediate participants to encompass entire ecosystems that depended upon such cooperation for maintaining the chemical and biological processes necessary for continued existence. Innovations that challenge contemporary assumptions about the sophistication of life that existed long before the evolution of animals with complex nervous systems or obvious capacities for reasoning about abstract relationships. Thomas joins Margaret at the window, carrying 2 cups of tea that steam in the cool morning air, and together they look across the valley toward the hills that contain fossil evidence of partnerships that operated according to principles they are only beginning to understand, cooperation that emerged from the patient work of countless generations of organisms learning to support each other through challenges that required collective wisdom rather than individual strength for successful navigation, strategies that were developed through trial and error across geological timescales and that proved their effectiveness when tested by the most severe environmental crisis that life on Earth has ever experienced. The silence between them feels comfortable and contemplative, the quiet of researchers who have glimpsed patterns that connect their work to questions larger than any individual discovery, insights that bridge the vast gulf of time separating the present from ancient communities that face challenges comparable to those confronting contemporary life, but that found solutions through cooperation rather than the technological approaches that characterize modern responses to environmental change. Innovations that suggest the importance of relationships and mutual care for maintaining the stability necessary for long-term survival in a world that is always, in its own mysterious way, testing the limits of what individual organisms can endure and revealing the hidden strengths that emerge when communities learn to work together in ways that create benefits extending far beyond the immediate participants to encompass the larger systems that support all life on Earth. The silence between them feels comfortable and contemplative, the quiet of researchers who have glimpsed patterns that connect their work to questions larger than any individual discovery. Insights that bridge the vast gulf of time separating the present from ancient communities that face challenges comparable to those confronting contemporary life, but that found solutions through cooperation rather than the technological approaches that characterize modern responses to environmental change. Innovations that suggest the importance of relationships and mutual care for maintaining the stability necessary for long-term survival in a world that is always, in its own mysterious way, testing the limits of what individual organisms can endure and revealing the hidden strengths that emerge when communities learn to work together in ways that create benefits extending far beyond the immediate participants to encompass the larger systems that support all life on Earth. Margaret and Thomas walk together through the limestone hills as spring arrives in the Peak District, their footsteps following paths that wind among outcrops where fossil evidence continues to reveal new details about the partnerships that allowed ancient communities to survive through the greatest crisis in the history of life, networks of cooperation that operated through mechanisms more sophisticated than anyone had previously imagined possible for organisms that lived so long ago. Strategies that suggest life has always possessed wisdom about survival that extends beyond what any individual can understand or achieve through solitary effort alone. Eleanor joins them for this spring fieldwork, bringing with her observations about modern cooperation that illuminate the continuity between ancient and contemporary approaches to collective survival. Partnerships that operate according to principles that transcend the specific conditions under which particular relationships evolve, evidence that cooperation represents a fundamental strategy that emerges whenever organisms face challenges, requiring collective wisdom rather than individual strength for successful navigation. Samuel arrives with soil samples from his Cotswolds garden and equipment for analyzing the chemical signatures of fungal networks that connect plant communities into larger systems capable of sharing resources and information across landscapes. Modern partnerships that seem to echo the ancient networks preserved in limestone formations, connections that suggest the strategies which proved crucial during the Great Dying continue to operate in contemporary ecosystems through mechanisms that maintain the stability and resilience necessary for community survival during periods of environmental change. The morning light reveals details in the rock faces that had been invisible during their earlier visits, subtle patterns of organization that become apparent only when examined by multiple researchers bringing different perspectives and methods to the same evidence. Collaborative approaches that mirror the cooperation they are studying in both ancient and modern communities. Strategies that create understanding extending beyond what any individual observer could achieve through independent investigation. Margaret points to a section of cliff where the preservation is particularly detailed, fossil assemblages that show evidence of the most extensive cooperation networks they have yet discovered, partnerships that seem to connect communities across what would have been significant distances of ancient seafloor, relationships that suggest coordination operating on scales that challenge contemporary assumptions about the capabilities of organisms without complex nervous systems or obvious methods of long-distance communication. Thomas photographs the formations from multiple angles while Eleanor sketches the spatial arrangements of different species, documenting patterns that seem too organized to be coincidental yet that operated through mechanisms so subtle they have remained hidden until revealed by patient analysis using techniques that make visible the traces of partnerships that were preserved against all odds in these particular specimens. Samuel collects samples for chemical analysis that will reveal whether the organic connections they observe in fossil assemblages utilized similar molecular pathways to those found in modern fungal networks, evidence that could illuminate the biochemical foundations of cooperation that allowed ancient communities to share resources and coordinate responses to environmental challenges that exceeded the capacity of individual adaptation. The spring air carries the scent of flowers blooming in fields that surround the limestone outcrops, reminders that the work of cooperation continues in the present through partnerships between plants and pollinators, between different species of soil organisms, between visible communities and the hidden networks that support their growth and reproduction. Relationships that demonstrate the continuity between ancient strategies for survival and the approaches that sustain modern ecosystems, through cycles of stress and recovery that have persisted for thousands of years. Eleanor describes observations from her recent work in Cornish tidal pools, communities that seem to anticipate environmental changes through forms of collective sensing that operate through chemical communication and behavioral coordination. Early warning systems that allow entire communities to prepare for challenges before they become severe enough to threaten individual survival. Strategies that might illuminate how ancient partnerships functioned during the gradual environmental changes that preceded the Great Dying. Samuel explains how the underground networks in his garden respond to seasonal fluctuations and longer-term changes in weather patterns, partnerships that seem to preserve and transmit information about successful survival strategies across generations of plants, biochemical libraries that can be accessed when similar conditions arise, knowledge that flows through fungal connections rather than through the genetic inheritance that operates within individual lineages, evidence that cooperation can serve as a form of collective memory that maintains community wisdom about adaptation and resilience. Margaret has been wondering whether the cooperation networks they have discovered might represent early experiments in what could be understood as ecosystem-level consciousness, partnerships that allowed ancient communities to process environmental information collectively and to respond through coordinated activities that transcended what individual organisms could achieve through their own sensory and cognitive capabilities. Innovations that suggest the emergence of distributed intelligence that operated at the scale of entire ecosystems rather than individual species. The fossil evidence seems to indicate that these networks became more sophisticated and extensive during periods when environmental conditions were becoming more challenging, partnerships that intensified as the gradual onset of crisis created pressure for collective solutions to survival challenges that exceeded the capacity of individual adaptation, strategies that were tested and refined over millions of years before they proved crucial when the Great Dying reached its peak intensity and transformed the rules for existence on Earth. Thomas considers whether such ecosystem-level intelligence might have provided ancient communities with forms of environmental sensing that allowed them to anticipate changes that would have been invisible to individual organisms, collective awareness that operated through the organic connections they have been documenting in limestone formations, early warning systems that facilitated preparation for challenges that had not yet materialized but that were somehow perceived by communities that possessed distributed sensing capabilities operating through partnerships between different species. Eleanor reflects on whether modern ecosystems might still retain remnants of the kinds of collective intelligence that allowed ancient communities to navigate the Great Dying, partnerships that operate through mechanisms too subtle for ordinary observation, but that become visible through careful analysis of the relationships that maintain stability in contemporary communities facing rapid environmental change, strategies that might represent continuations of approaches to survival that have persisted through hundreds of millions of years because they provide fundamental solutions to challenges that arise whenever organisms must coordinate their activities to maintain the conditions necessary for long-term persistence. Samuel wonders whether the fungal networks he studies might serve as modern examples of the communication systems that allowed ancient cooperation to operate on the scales documented in Permian fossil assemblages, underground partnerships that facilitate coordination between plant communities across landscapes through chemical signals that carry information about environmental conditions and resource availability, networks that might preserve and transmit knowledge about successful adaptation. Strategies in ways that create collective memory extending beyond the lifespans of individual organisms, evidence that cooperation can transcend the boundaries between generations and create forms of community wisdom that persist through cycles of environmental change and recovery. The researchers worked together throughout the spring day, their collaboration demonstrating the same principles of partnership that they are studying in ancient limestone and modern ecosystems. Cooperative approaches to understanding that create insights extending beyond what any individual could achieve through independent investigation. Strategies that mirror the networks they are documenting in communities separated by hundreds of millions of years, yet connected by universal principles of mutual support and collective response to environmental challenge. Margaret shares field notes accumulated over decades of patient observation, documentation that reveals how her understanding of ancient cooperation has evolved through gradual accumulation of evidence rather than dramatic moments of discovery. Insights that emerged from sustained attention to patterns that were always present but that required new ways of seeing to become visible. Approaches to research that depend upon the same qualities of patience and persistence that characterized the communities that learned to survive through cooperation during the most challenging periods in the history of life on Earth. Thomas contributes photographic archives that document the gradual revelation of network structures in fossil assemblages. Images that show how details become apparent only when examined from multiple perspectives and under different conditions of lighting and magnification. Evidence that understanding ancient partnerships requires methods of observation that match the subtlety of the relationships being studied, techniques that make visible the traces of cooperation that operated through mechanisms so delicate they challenged the preservational processes that normally eliminate all evidence of soft tissue connections between organisms. Eleanor brings sketches and observations from years of studying modern cooperation in tidal pool communities. Documentation that reveals how partnerships between different species follow consistent patterns despite developing under varying environmental conditions. Evidence that cooperation operates according to universal principles that transcend the specific circumstances under which particular relationships evolve. Strategies that suggest fundamental approaches to survival that have been discovered independently by communities facing different types of environmental challenge, yet arriving at similar solutions through the patient work of evolutionary experimentation across geological timescales. Samuel shares data about the chemical pathways that operate through fungal networks in contemporary plant communities, analysis that illuminates the biochemical foundations of cooperation, and that might provide insights into the molecular mechanisms that allowed ancient partnerships to function as communication and resource-sharing systems. Evidence that the organic connections preserved in fossil assemblages utilize similar approaches to those found in modern ecosystems. Strategies that represent optimal solutions to the challenge of coordinating activities between organisms that lack obvious methods of direct communication yet that must work together to maintain the stability necessary for community survival. The afternoon progresses quietly as the researchers continue their collaborative fieldwork, each contribution adding details to an understanding that emerges gradually through the patient accumulation of observations from multiple perspectives, approaches that demonstrate how cooperation operates not only in the ancient and modern communities they study, but also in the human activities required for investigating such partnerships, strategies that create knowledge extending beyond what any individual researcher could achieve through independent work. Innovations that suggest the universal applicability of cooperative principles for addressing challenges that exceed the capacity of individual effort, whether in ancient ecosystems facing environmental crisis or in contemporary scientific investigations seeking to understand the deep history of survival and adaptation that connects all living systems across vast expanses of time and space. Margaret points out subtle details in fossil arrangements that might have been missed by observers working alone. Patterns that become apparent only when examined by multiple researchers bringing different types of expertise to the same evidence. Collaborative approaches that reveal connections between individual specimens and larger networks of relationship that operated across ancient communities. Partnerships that created benefits extending far beyond the immediate participants to encompass entire ecosystems that depended upon such cooperation for maintaining the conditions necessary for persistence through the environmental changes that transformed the late Permian world. Thomas explains how the photographic techniques he has developed can reveal organic connections that are invisible under ordinary lighting conditions, methods that make visible the traces of ancient partnerships through careful manipulation of illumination and contrast, evidence that cooperation operated through mechanisms so subtle they required perfect conditions for preservation yet that have survived in sufficient detail to provide insights into the sophistication of relationships that developed between organisms millions of years before the evolution of complex nervous systems or obvious capacities for reasoning about abstract concepts. Innovations that suggest forms of collective intelligence that operated through partnerships rather than through the individual cognition that characterizes more familiar approaches to environmental sensing and response. Eleanor describes how her observations of modern cooperation reveal behavioral patterns that seem to anticipate environmental changes. Collective responses that begin before individual organisms show obvious signs of stress. Early warning systems that operate through chemical communication and social coordination rather than through the technological monitoring that characterizes contemporary approaches to environmental management. Strategies that might illuminate how ancient communities were able to prepare for the challenges of the Great Dying through partnerships that facilitated collective sensing and coordinated response to threats that would have been invisible to organisms dependent upon individual awareness and adaptation. Samuel demonstrates how soil analysis can reveal the extent and complexity of underground networks that connect plant communities into larger systems capable of sharing resources and information across landscapes. Modern partnerships that operate according to principles similar to those documented in ancient fossil assemblages, evidence that cooperation represents a fundamental strategy for survival that has been discovered and rediscovered by countless generations of organisms facing challenges that require collective wisdom rather than individual strength for successful navigation. Innovations that suggest universal approaches to the maintenance of stability and resilience in environments that present constant threats to individual persistence, yet that offer opportunities for collective flourishing when communities learn to work together in ways that create benefits extending beyond immediate participants. The late afternoon light slants across the limestone cliffs in ways that emphasize the layered structure of rocks that contain evidence of partnerships spanning millions of years of evolutionary time. Formations that preserve snapshots of communities as they responded to changing conditions through cooperation that became more sophisticated and extensive as environmental challenges intensified, strategies that were tested and refined across geological ages and that proved crucial for survival. When the familiar world dissolved and new approaches to existence became necessary for persistence through the greatest crisis that life on Earth has ever faced. The researchers gather their equipment as the day draws toward evening, their movements slow and careful as they handle specimens and instruments that have revealed details about ancient worlds that seemed impossible to recover just a few decades ago. Technologies and techniques that make visible the traces of partnerships operating through mechanisms too subtle to be detected by casual observation. Evidence of cooperation that challenges contemporary assumptions about the capabilities of organisms that lived so long ago, yet that suggests forms of collective intelligence and coordinated response that might provide guidance for understanding how communities could maintain stability during periods of rapid environmental change that exceed the capacity of individual adaptation. Margaret wraps each fossil specimen carefully in tissue paper before placing it in collection boxes that will preserve evidence of ancient cooperation for future analysis. Documentation that represents decades of patient fieldwork and that might contain details not yet noticed by current methods of investigation, patterns that could become visible through techniques that have not yet been developed, or perspectives that emerge from approaches to understanding that transcend the boundaries between different disciplines and ways of knowing, evidence that cooperation operates on scales and through mechanisms that continue to reveal new levels of complexity as methods of observation become more sophisticated, and as researchers learn to ask questions that illuminate previously hidden aspects of partnership and mutual support. Thomas photographs the cliff face in the golden light of approaching sunset, documenting the site where their most significant discoveries have been made and creating a visual record that captures the beauty of landscapes that contain evidence of cooperation spanning hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history. Formations that connect the present to ancient communities through stone that preserves traces of partnerships operating through mechanisms so delicate they challenge the ordinary processes of fossilization, yet that have survived to provide insights into the sophistication of relationships that allowed life to persist through its greatest crisis. Innovations that suggest the importance of mutual care and collective wisdom for maintaining the conditions necessary for survival when individual adaptation proves inadequate for navigating environmental challenges that exceed the capacity of any single organism to understand or address through solitary effort. Eleanor closes her field notebook after recording observations that connect her studies of modern cooperation with the ancient partnerships documented in limestone formations. Evidence that cooperation follows universal principles that transcend the specific conditions under which particular relationships evolve, strategies that emerge whenever organisms face challenges requiring collective response rather than individual solutions, approaches to survival that have deep roots in the evolutionary history of life and that continue to operate through partnerships that maintain the stability and resilience necessary for community persistence through cycles of environmental change and recovery that characterize the ongoing evolution of ecosystems on Earth. Samuel packs soil samples that will be analyzed for chemical signatures of cooperation, evidence that modern fungal networks utilize molecular pathways similar to those that might have operated through the organic connections preserved in ancient fossil assemblages. Strategies that represent optimal solutions to the challenge of coordinating activities between organisms that must work together to maintain stable communities, yet that lack obvious methods of direct communication. Innovations that suggest cooperation operates through biochemical languages that transcend the boundaries between different species, and that create benefits extending far beyond immediate participants to encompass entire ecosystems that depend upon such partnerships for maintaining the conditions necessary for long-term survival and flourishing. The evening light fades slowly across the Peak District as the researchers make their way back along paths that wind through fields where sheep graze among limestone outcrops containing their own fossil treasures. Evidence of different experiments in cooperation and survival that played out across millions of years of evolutionary time, communities that tested various approaches to partnership and mutual support under changing environmental conditions, and that contributed to the gradual development of strategies that would prove crucial when the Great Dying challenged life to discover new forms of collective wisdom capable of navigating the most severe environmental crisis in the history of existence on this planet. Margaret walks slowly through her cottage as darkness settles over the valleys and hills that contain evidence of ancient partnerships, her footsteps soft against wooden floors that have supported decades of quiet contemplation about the deep history of cooperation and the strategies that allowed life to persist through challenges that seemed impossible to survive through individual effort alone. Innovations that suggest the fundamental importance of relationships and mutual care for maintaining the conditions necessary for existence in a world that is always testing the limits of what living systems can endure, yet that reveals hidden strengths when communities learn to work together in ways that transcend the boundaries between different species, and that create collective wisdom extending beyond what any individual organism could achieve through solitary adaptation. She lights a single candle that creates a circle of warm illumination in her study, golden light that seems to hold space for thinking about time in ways that connect the present moment to the vast expanses of deep history that flow beneath the surface of ordinary experience. Hours that move like still water between the demands of daylight and the rest that comes with dawn. Quiet intervals when the mind can settle into rhythms that match the patient processes through which understanding emerges. From sustained attention to patterns that reveal themselves slowly through the accumulation of small observations and careful comparisons across multiple scales of time and space. Thomas sits at his desk in Edinburgh, arranging photographs and specimens in sequences that tell stories about partnerships that developed over geological ages. Relationships that began with simple resource sharing and evolved into networks sophisticated enough to allow entire ecosystems to respond collectively to environmental changes. Innovations that were tested and refined across millions of years before they proved crucial for survival during the Great Crisis that reshaped the conditions. For life on Earth, evidence that cooperation has ancient roots in the history of existence, and that the strategies which allowed life to persist through its greatest challenge represent fundamental approaches to collective survival that continue to operate through partnerships that maintain stability and resilience in contemporary communities facing their own forms of environmental change and challenge. Eleanor prepares tea in her cottage overlooking the Cornish coast, the ritual of heating water and arranging cups providing a quiet transition between the intense focus of fieldwork and the broader contemplation that comes when evidence begins to form patterns suggesting larger meanings about the nature of cooperation and the ways that organisms learn to care for each other when individual survival becomes impossible and collective wisdom offers the only pathway through challenges that exceed the capacity of any single being to navigate alone. Samuel walks through his garden in the starlight, the earth cool beneath his feet, as he moves among plants connected by underground networks that operate as communication systems, allowing communities to share information and resources through fungal partnerships that demonstrate the continuity between ancient and modern approaches to cooperation, strategies that have persisted across hundreds of millions of years, because they represent optimal solutions to challenges that arise whenever organisms must coordinate their activities to maintain the conditions necessary for survival in environments that present constant threats to individual persistence, yet that offer opportunities for collective flourishing when communities learn to work together in ways that create benefits extending beyond immediate participants to encompass the larger systems that support all forms of life. The candle flame in Margaret's study burns steadily through the quiet hours of night, its light reflecting off specimens and photographs that contain evidence of partnerships operating through mechanisms more sophisticated than anyone had previously imagined possible for communities that existed so long ago. Innovations that challenge contemporary assumptions about the capabilities of ancient life yet that suggest forms of collective intelligence and coordinated response that might provide guidance for understanding how cooperation could emerge as a dominant strategy for survival during periods when familiar approaches prove inadequate for maintaining stability in rapidly changing environments. The night air moves gently through open windows carrying the scent of grass and flowers from fields where modern communities demonstrate the same principles of partnership that allowed ancient life to survive through the greatest crisis in the history of existence on Earth. Strategies that operate according to universal principles transcending the specific conditions under which particular relationships evolve. Approaches to survival that suggest the fundamental importance of mutual care and collective wisdom for navigating challenges that exceed the capacity of individual adaptation. Innovations that connect the present to deep time through threads of understanding that can only be maintained by patient attention to the subtle patterns that reveal themselves slowly through sustained observation and careful analysis of evidence preserved against all odds in formations that bridge vast expanses of evolutionary history. The candle burns lower as the hours pass, its flame creating shadows that shift and dance across pages filled with observations about cooperation spanning millions of years. Partnerships that allowed life to discover new forms of collective response to environmental challenge, strategies that were tested during gradual changes, and that proved crucial when crisis reached its peak intensity and transformed the rules for existence in ways that eliminated most organisms dependent upon individual adaptation yet that revealed hidden strengths available to communities that had learned to work together through relationships that created benefits extending far beyond immediate participants to encompass entire ecosystems capable of maintaining stability through cooperation rather than competition. The flame grows smaller as dawn approaches, its light fading gradually like the memory of ancient seas where partnerships first emerged that would prove crucial for survival through the greatest challenge life has ever faced. Innovations that suggest the deep history of cooperation and the strategies that allowed existence to persist through transformation that seemed impossible to navigate through individual effort alone. Evidence that life has always possessed wisdom about survival extending beyond what any single organism could understand or achieve. Approaches to collective flourishing that operate through relationships transcending the boundaries between different species, and that create networks of mutual support capable of maintaining the conditions necessary for continuation through cycles of challenge and recovery that characterize the ongoing evolution of communities on Earth. Partnerships that connect the present to ancient wisdom through threads of cooperation that flow like still water beneath the surface of ordinary experience, carrying forward the patient work of caring for each other that allowed life to survive its greatest crisis, and that continues to operate through mechanisms both visible and hidden in communities that span the spectrum from ancient fossil assemblages to modern ecosystems that demonstrate the universal importance of working together when individual strength proves insufficient for navigating the challenges that test the limits of what existence can endure yet that reveal new possibilities for collective wisdom when organisms learn to transcend the boundaries of individual survival and discover the hidden strengths that emerge when communities commit themselves to the patient work of mutual care and support that creates conditions allowing all participants to flourish together under the wide sky that holds space for all forms of life to continue their ancient exploration of what it means to exist in partnership with each other, and with the larger systems that sustain the ongoing miracle of consciousness awakening to itself through countless forms of cooperation that connect every breath to the deep history of survival and every moment of awareness to the vast networks of relationship that make existence possible.